The arrogant headmaster brushed off the vicious prank that landed my daughter in the intensive care unit. Headmaster Wallace Sterling literally chuckled, telling me my teenage daughter was just being overly dramatic, while Maya sat trembling beside me, her fingertips still blue from severe hypothermia. Sterling delivered this verdict from behind his massive oak desk at the Hawthorne Elite Academy in Bethesda, Maryland, surrounded by antique rowing trophies and photos of himself golfing with state senators. His voice dripped with the smug patience of a man who assumed I was just another hysterical, working-class parent looking for a payout. Maya was only 14. She had spent the last 48 hours hooked up to IV monitors at Johns Hopkins after being trapped in an unheated outdoor maintenance shed overnight during a winter school retreat. When she finally thawed out enough to speak, the terrifying truth spilled out. The lacrosse team captains had lured her out there, locked the deadbolt, and confiscated her phone because she refused to let them copy her AP Physics final project. She screamed for hours in freezing temperatures. They left her there. I didn't shout. I carefully compiled the hospital records, the timestamps from her frozen smartwatch, and the weather reports documenting the 18-degree night. Then I demanded a formal disciplinary hearing. I had been the chief ethics investigator for the Maryland Department of Education for 5 years, but I kept my career completely divorced from my family life. I drove a 10-year-old Honda. I listed my occupation simply as state employee on her enrollment forms. My wife, Sarah, had begged me to drop my title on the Hawthorne administration on day one to ensure Maya was protected, but I stubbornly wanted our daughter to navigate high school based on her own brilliance, not my political leverage. Sitting in that suffocating office, listening to Sterling protect her abusers, I realized my humility had nearly cost my daughter her life. Sterling didn't even glance at the medical file. He launched into a polished, sickening monologue about how high schoolers engage in competitive pranks, how resilience is built through adversity, and how the accidental lock-in was just a game of hide-and-seek gone awry. He made sure to point out that the main culprit, Harrison Caldwell, was the son of the Hawthorne Academy's largest financial benefactor, Mr. Vance. Sterling sighed, adjusting his silk tie. Maya has always been a rather high-strung girl. Sometimes teenagers who lack social grace perceive harmless initiation rituals as malicious attacks. He was openly accusing my daughter of faking frostbite to ruin a rich boy's reputation. I asked him directly if he planned to suspend the boys who left her to freeze. Sterling coldly informed me that, rather than punishing promising young men, he was officially placing Maya on academic probation for wandering off bounds. He advised me that if I couldn't handle Hawthorne's elite culture, I should withdraw her immediately. He then checked his Rolex and stood up, declaring the Malter closed. I didn't stand. Instead, I unzipped my leather briefcase and pulled out the thick, red-sealed audit folder I had finalized at 3 a.m. I dropped my gold State Board of Education Chief Investigator badge right on top of his precious mahogany desk. Actually, Dr. Sterling, nobody is withdrawing, I said, my voice echoing off the paneled walls. I am Arthur Vance, Chief Ethics Investigator for the state of Maryland, and this folder contains the emergency court injunction I filed this morning to freeze all of Hawthorne state funding, alongside a grand jury subpoena for your administrative hard drives. Sterling collapsed back into his leather chair, all the color draining from his smug face. The silence in that office was heavy. You could hear the faint ticking of a grandfather clock in the corner, and the distant sound of students laughing on the quad, blissfully unaware that their school's foundation was currently being liquidated. Sterling's hand went to his throat, fumbling with the silk tie he'd been so proud of 5 minutes ago. He tried to speak, but his voice came out as a dry croak. He looked at the badge, then at the red seal on the folder, then finally at Maya. He wasn't looking at her like a high-strung girl anymore. He was looking at her like she was a ticking time bomb. Arthur, he started. His voice regained a desperate, oily sheen. Let's not be hasty. We're all professionals here. I had no idea you were. I mean, your file says state employee. Usually, that means clerical, or it means I know exactly where the bodies are buried in the Maryland private school system, Wallace. I cut him off. I didn't raise my voice. I kept it flat, the way I do when I'm interviewing a crooked superintendent. I spent my morning reviewing Hawthorne's tax-exempt status. Did you know that receiving even $1 of state-allocated technology grants makes you subject to my department's oversight? And since you accepted $4.2 million for that new science and innovation wing 3 years ago, you belong to me. I reached over and pulled the medical photos of Maya's hands out of the folder. I spread them across his desk, right over his calendar. Look at them, I commanded. He flinched but didn't look. I said, look at them. That's stage 2 hypothermia. If the night shift janitor hadn't forgotten his keys and walked past that shed at 5 a.m., my daughter would be dead, and you called it a prank. Maya reached out and touched my arm. Her hand was still wrapped in a light gauze, and she was shaking not from the cold anymore, but from the sheer weight of being in the same room as the man who had just tried to erase her trauma. I squeezed her hand back. I wanted her to see this. I wanted her to see what happens when the bullies lose their protection. Sterling finally looked up, his eyes darting toward the door. We can settle this internally. The boys, Harrison, and the others, they come from very influential families. Arthur, if you do this, you're not just coming for me. You're coming for the board of trustees. You're coming for the Caldwells. Do you really want that kind of war? For a misunderstanding? It's not a war, Wallace. It's an audit, I said. And as for the influential families, they've already been notified. I didn't just file with the Board of Ed. I sent a copy of the police report, the one you tried to stop the campus security from filing directly to the district attorney's office. My office has a very close relationship with them. His face went from pale to a sickly, mottled gray. He knew the name Caldwell carried weight in this town, but the state of Maryland carried the scale. He reached for his desk phone, probably to call his lawyer or the chairman of the board, but his hand stopped midair. He realized that if he made that call now, it would be on the record of a state investigation. What do you want? He whispered. I want what's legal, I said. I want the security footage from the retreat. I want the unedited logs from the teachers who were supposed to be supervising, and I want the disciplinary records of every student involved in the last 5 years, because I have a feeling my daughter isn't the first person Harrison Caldwell has hurt. She's just the first one whose father has the power to pull the plug on your life's work. Sterling's eyes shifted to the red-sealed folder. The funding. You can't just freeze it. We have payroll. We have scholarships. Then I suggest you start thinking about who is more important to the survival of this school, I said. A boy whose father writes checks, or the integrity of the institution that receives them. Because as of right now, Hawthorne is under state receivership. I've already sent the technicians. They're in your server room right now. Just then, his desk phone actually did ring. He stared at it like it was a snake. He pressed the speaker button with a trembling finger. It was his secretary, her voice sounding panicked and thin. Dr. Sterling, there are men here. They say they're from the state auditor's office. They're asking for the server keys and the master keys to the maintenance buildings. They have a warrant. Sterling looked at me, his mouth hanging open. He hadn't expected me to move this fast. He thought I'd give him a few days to scrub the files, to talk to the parents, to get a narrative together. He didn't realize that when it comes to my daughter, I don't follow the standard 30-day notice period. Tell them to wait in the lobby, Sterling managed to say into the phone. No, I said, leaning forward until I was inches from his face. Tell them to start with the disciplinary files in the basement, and tell them to make sure they secure the footage from the night of the 14th. Maya stood up then. She looked at Sterling, and for the first time since we'd walked in, her shoulders weren't hunched. She looked at the man who had tried to gaslight her, and she didn't see a powerful headmaster. She saw a scared, middle-aged man in an expensive suit who was about to lose everything. I didn't wander off bounds, she said, her voice small but steady. They pushed me, and you knew. Sterling couldn't even look her in the eye. He looked at the floor, at the expensive Persian rug that the school's innovation fund had probably paid for. We walked out of the office, leaving him sitting there in the wreckage of his own arrogance. As we hit the hallway, the reality of the situation was already starting to ripple through the school. Teachers were gathered in small groups, whispering. Two men in dark suits, my team, were standing by the main administrative desk, holding clipboards and digital imaging devices. They nodded to me as I passed. I took Maya to the car. I sat in the driver's seat for a second, my hands gripping the steering wheel so hard my knuckles were white. The adrenaline was starting to fade, replaced by a cold, hard anger that I knew wasn't going away anytime soon. Dad? Maya asked softly. Is he going to jail? I don't know about jail yet, honey, I said, starting the engine. But he's never going to run a school again. And those boys, they're going to find out that their last names don't mean a thing to a judge. I drove out of the gates of Hawthorne, but as I glanced in the rearview mirror, I saw a black SUV pulling into the driveway. It was a high-end Lexus, the kind Harrison Caldwell's father drove. He was probably coming to straighten things out with Sterling. He had no idea he was walking into a crime scene. When we got home, Sarah was waiting on the porch. She saw the look on my face, and then the way Maya walked up the steps, not defeated, but tired. We spent the evening in a weird sort of limbo. I was on the phone with the DA's office until 10 p.m., coordinating the handoff of the evidence my team was pulling from the school. Just as I was hanging up the final call, my personal cell rang. It was an unknown number. Usually, I don't answer those, but tonight was different. Arthur Vance? A man's voice said. It was deep, controlled, and possessed that specific kind of gravelly confidence that comes from owning half the zip code. This is Richard Caldwell. I think we need to have a very private conversation before this goes any further. There's nothing to talk about, Mr. Caldwell, I said. The investigation is already in motion. Everything is negotiable, Arthur, he replied. I understand you're upset. I'd be upset too, but let's be realistic. You're a state employee. You have a career to think about. My son has a future. Surely there's a way to resolve this that doesn't involve destroying everyone's lives over a night in a shed. A night in a shed, I repeated. The casual way he dismissed it made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. Your son left my daughter to freeze to death. He stole her phone so she couldn't call for help. That's not a night in a shed. That's felony endangerment. It's a he said, she said, Caldwell said, his tone shifting from conciliatory to a sharp, cold edge. And I have the best legal team in the tri-state area. By the time we're done, the narrative will be that your daughter had a breakdown and the boys tried to help her. Don't make this harder than it needs to be. I'm offering you a graceful exit. Withdraw the injunction, and we can discuss a very significant scholarship for Maya's future education elsewhere. You're trying to bribe a state official, Richard, I said, recording the call with my work phone on the desk. You're adding a third-degree felony to your son's list. I'd stop talking if I were you. There was a long pause on the other end. You think you're a hero, don't you? You think that badge makes you untouchable. It doesn't. It just makes you a target for the people who actually run this state. Check your email, Arthur. I think you'll find that your department head is having a very long dinner with some of my associates right now. He hung up. I felt a cold knot form in my stomach. I opened my laptop and refreshed my work email. There was one new message. It wasn't from my boss. It was a formal notification from the Office of Budget and Management. My department's funding for the upcoming quarter had been flagged for emergency review due to administrative irregularities. They weren't just protecting the boys. They were coming for my job to shut me up. I looked at the red-sealed folder on my desk. I had the evidence, but Caldwell was right about one thing. He had the reach. I looked at Maya's room, where the light was still on under the door. She was finally starting to feel safe, and these people were already moving the chess pieces to take that away. I didn't go to bed. I spent the next 4 hours digging through the Hawthorne files my team had managed to mirror before the emergency review hit. I wasn't looking for the prank anymore. I was looking for the money. If Caldwell was this desperate to protect Sterling and the school, it wasn't just about his son's reputation. At 2:45 a.m., I found it. A series of consulting fees paid out from the Hawthorne endowment to a shell company registered in Delaware. The company's address was a P.O. box. The primary shareholder? Richard Caldwell. It wasn't a school. It was a laundromat. And my daughter's prank had just accidentally kicked the door open on a multi-million-dollar embezzlement scheme involving the very people who were supposed to be supervising my department. The next morning, I didn't go to the office. I didn't answer the 3 missed calls from my boss. Instead, I drove Maya to her therapist appointment. Then I detoured to a small, nondescript diner in Annapolis. I sat in a booth at the back, waiting. 10 minutes later, a woman in a sharp gray blazer sat down across from me. She was the lead auditor for the Internal Revenue Service's criminal division. We'd worked together on a charter school fraud case 2 years ago. You look like hell, Arthur, she said, sliding a coffee toward me. I've had a long night, I said, sliding a thumb drive across the table. I need you to look at Hawthorne Academy, specifically the relationship between the board chair and the school's endowment fund. The Caldwells? She whistled. That's a big swing. You sure you want to go there? I heard your department is under the microscope this morning. That's exactly why I'm here, I said. They think they can kill the investigation by killing my job. They don't realize I don't need my job to bury them. I just need a friend with a different jurisdiction. She tucked the drive into her bag. If this is what you say it is, Arthur, it's not just a school board scandal. It's federal. Good, I said, because I want them to see it coming from a mile away. As I walked back to my car, my phone buzzed. It was a text from an unknown number. We saw you at the diner. Last chance to walk away, Arthur. Think about Maya. I looked around the parking lot. A silver sedan was idling near the exit. No one got out. No one pointed a gun. They were just watching, reminding me that they knew where I was. It was a classic intimidation tactic, the kind people use when they're starting to panic. I got in my Honda and pulled out. I didn't go home. I went to the one place they wouldn't expect. I went back to Hawthorne Academy. The campus was crawling with tension. The news of the state audit had leaked, and parents were already pulling up in their SUVs, looking frantic. I walked straight past the front desk, ignoring the secretary's protests, and headed for the maintenance wing. I wanted to see the shed. I wanted to see exactly where they left her. The shed was tucked behind the gymnasium, a corrugated metal box that looked like it hadn't been painted in a decade. It was cold, even in the morning. morning sun. I walked up to the door. The deadbolt was still there, heavy, rusted, and definitely not something a 14-year-old could kick open. As I stood there, I heard footsteps on the gravel. I turned around, expecting a security guard. Instead, it was a boy. He was wearing the Hawthorne blazer, but his tie was loose, and he looked like he hadn't slept either. He was tall, athletic, the kind of kid who's told he's a god from the moment he hits puberty. "You're her dad," he said. It wasn't a question. "And you're Harrison," I said. He didn't look like the monster Maya had described. He just looked like a kid who had realized far too late that the world didn't actually belong to him. "I didn't think it would get this cold," he whispered, looking at the shed. We were just going to leave her for an hour, to scare her. But then we went to the party at the cabin, and everyone was drinking, and I forgot. I forgot the key. "You forgot," I said. I felt the anger rising again, hot and sharp. "She almost died because you forgot?" "My dad says he's going to fix it," Harrison said. And for a second, I saw a flash of genuine terror in his eyes. "But he's screaming at everyone. He's never been this angry. He said if I don't get you to stop, he's sending me to military school in Switzerland. He said you're ruining everything." "I'm not ruining anything, Harrison," I said. "You did that the second you turned that key. Your father isn't trying to save you. He's trying to save himself. Do you know why he's so angry?" The boy shook his head. "Because he's been stealing from this school for years. And because you decided to be a bully, you brought the one man into this building who knows how to find the proof." Harrison stared at me, the realization sinking in. He wasn't just a spoiled kid anymore. He was the catalyst for his father's downfall. "There's more," Harrison said, his voice trembling. "In Sterling's office, there's a second set of books. He keeps them in the safe behind the rowing photo. He told my dad he'd burn them if the auditors stayed too long." "Why are you telling me this?" I asked. "Because," Harrison looked down at his shoes. "Maya was the only one who didn't treat me like I was a Caldwell. She just thought I was an idiot who couldn't do physics. She was right. I don't want her to be scared anymore." I looked at him for a long beat. It didn't excuse what he did. It wouldn't stop the charges I was filing, but it was the first crack in the wall. "Go home, Harrison," I said, "and tell your father I'm not interested in his scholarship." I headed back toward the main building. I had work to do. I needed that second set of books before Sterling found a match. But as I reached the administrative wing, I saw 3 black sedans pull into the circle. These weren't Caldwell's cars. They had government plates. My friend from the IRS hadn't waited. She'd brought the cavalry. The next few hours were a blur of shouting, slammed doors, and the sound of heavy filing cabinets being wheeled out. Sterling was let out in handcuffs, not for what he did to Maya, but for the millions of dollars missing from the endowment. The prank was the footnote that broke the empire. I stood on the steps of the school, watching the chaos. My phone buzzed. It was a message from my boss. "Arthur, there's been a mistake. The budget review has been rescinded. Please come in on Monday. We need to talk about your promotion." I deleted the message. I wasn't going back to that office. If they were that easy to buy off, I didn't want to work for them. I went back to the car where Maya was waiting. She saw the police cars, saw Sterling being put into the back of a cruiser. "Is it over?" she asked. "The school part is," I said. "But we have a lot of work to do. We need to find you a new school. Somewhere where the only thing that matters is how good you are at physics." She smiled, then a real, genuine smile. "I already looked at the public high school's curriculum. They have a robotics club." "Then that's where we're going," I said. As we drove away, I saw Richard Caldwell standing by his Lexus, watching his world burn. He looked at me, and for the first time, I didn't see a powerful man. I saw a man who had finally run out of people to bribe. But as we pulled onto the main road, my dashboard lit up with a new notification. An encrypted file had been sent to my private email. The subject line was just a series of numbers, the coordinates for the maintenance shed. I opened it at a red light. It was a video file. I hit play. It wasn't the retreat. It was from 2 months ago. It showed Sterling and Caldwell in the shed, late at night, moving heavy crates that weren't filled with school supplies. The story wasn't over. It was just shifting gears. And I realized that Harrison hadn't just given me the books. He'd given me the map to something much deeper. I looked at Maya, who was looking out the window at the passing trees, finally breathing normally. I realized then that protecting her didn't mean stopping the fight. It meant finishing it. I took the next exit, but I didn't go home. I headed toward the state police barracks. I had one more folder to deliver. The road ahead was long, and the people I was going after had a lot more to lose than a headmaster's job. But they had made one fatal mistake. They had touched my daughter. And in my world, that's the only audit you don't survive. I pulled the Honda into the visitor lot of the Maryland State Police Barracks in Pikesville and cut the engine. The building was a brutalist concrete block, completely devoid of the ivy-draped charm of Hawthorne Academy. I liked it that way. It felt like reality. I looked over at Maya. She had fallen asleep against the passenger window, the gentle rhythm of her breathing, a stark contrast to the frantic beating of my own heart. I didn't wake her. I cracked the windows, locked the doors, and walked into the precinct alone. Detective Miller looked like a man who hadn't slept since 2018. He was sitting at a metal desk covered in empty Dunkin' cups and manila folders, typing with 2 fingers on a keyboard that had seen better decades. I dropped the thumb drive and the printed stills from the video onto his keyboard. "What's this, Arthur?" he asked, rubbing his eyes. We knew each other. "You don't spend 5 years investigating state education budgets without crossing paths with the fraud division. That," I pointed to the drive, "is Wallace Sterling and Richard Caldwell moving undocumented school assets out of the Hawthorne maintenance shed 2 months ago. It corroborates the shell company payouts I flagged this morning. They were fencing high-end tech equipment bought with state grant money." Miller sighed, a long, weary sound that deflated his entire posture. He picked up one of the printed photos. "I heard about what happened to your kid, Art. I'm sorry, but if you're bringing me this because you're pissed off about a bullying incident, I'm bringing you this because they stole $4 million from the taxpayers," I interrupted. "The fact that they almost killed my daughter in the process is just what made me look under the hood. The IRS is already on it. I suggest you guys get moving before federal takes all the credit." That got his attention. He sat up straighter, slipping the drive into an evidence bag. "I'll log it, but you know how these guys operate. Caldwell has a legal team that costs more than this entire precinct's operating budget. They're going to drag this out for years, and they are going to come after you." "Let them," I said. But saying it in a police station and living it are two completely different things. The reality of taking on a man like Richard Caldwell didn't look like a movie. There were no mysterious cars following me home. There were no midnight phone calls with heavy breathing. The retaliation was entirely corporate, completely legal, and suffocatingly quiet. It started on Tuesday. I was at the grocery store, buying a week's worth of normal, boring food. Maya was officially enrolled at the public high school, and Sarah and I were trying to establish a new routine, a new normal. I swiped my debit card at the register. Declined. I frowned, apologized to the cashier, and swiped my credit card. Declined. A cold sweat broke out on the back of my neck. I stepped out of line, leaving a cart full of groceries sitting there, and called my bank. After 20 minutes on hold, listening to elevator music, a very polite representative informed me that a temporary temporary freeze had been placed on all my accounts due to a pending civil litigation lien. What litigation? I asked, pacing the sidewalk outside the Safeway. It looks like a defamation and tortious interference suit, sir, the voice said. Filed yesterday in Montgomery County Court. The plaintiffs requested an emergency freeze on your assets pending the outcome, citing flight risk. Flight risk? I'm a state employee, I practically shouted into the phone, but the kid on the other end couldn't do anything. I drove home in silence. When I pulled into the driveway, a man in a cheap gray suit was leaning against my mailbox. He didn't look like a hitman. He looked bored. He walked up to my window as I rolled it down. Arthur Vance? He asked. Yeah. He dropped a stack of paper the size of a phone book onto my lap. You've been served. I took the papers inside and laid them out on the kitchen table. Sarah came downstairs, took one look at the documents, and then looked at my face. What is it? She asked, her voice tight. It's Caldwell, I said, flipping through the pages. The legal jargon was dense, but the message was clear. They were suing me personally for $10 million. They claimed I used my official government position to conduct a vendetta against the school, unlawfully freezing their funds and causing irreparable reputational damage to both the institution and the Caldwell family. Can they do that? Sarah asked, sitting down heavily in the chair opposite me. Anyone can sue anyone for anything if they have the filing fee, I said, rubbing my temples. It's a slap suit. They know they can't win. They don't want to win. They just want to bury us in legal fees until we break. They froze our accounts, Sarah. All of them. Even Maya's college fund. Sarah didn't cry. She didn't yell. She just stared at the thick stack of paper. How do we pay the mortgage? I don't know yet. The next few weeks were a grind that stripped the romanticism out of being a whistleblower. I was technically on administrative leave from my job. My boss hadn't officially fired me. The IRS investigation made me too hot to touch, but he made it clear I wasn't welcome in the building until the dust settled, which meant I was sitting at home, fielding calls from pro bono lawyers who all told me the same thing. Fighting Caldwell would take years, and we'd likely lose the house in the process. Maya started at the public high school. She didn't complain, but I could see the toll it was taking. She had gone from being a top-tier student at an elite academy to the new girl in the middle of the semester at a school with metal detectors at the doors. One evening, I found her sitting on the floor of her bedroom, staring at her AP Physics textbook. She wasn't reading it. She was just staring. Hey, I said softly, knocking on the doorframe. You stuck on a problem? She looked up. The blue tint was completely gone from her fingertips now, but I still saw it every time I looked at her hands. No, the physics here is, it's easy. We're covering stuff I did in October. She closed the book and pulled her knees up to her chest. Dad, I saw the mail today. The letter from the bank. I felt my stomach drop. I had been trying to intercept the foreclosure warnings. Maya, you don't need to worry about that. I'm handling it. Are we going to lose the house? She asked. Her voice was terrifyingly calm. It was the same voice she used in Sterling's office. The voice of a kid who had been forced to grow up way too fast. No, I lied. Or at least I hoped it was a lie. It's just a legal tactic. Caldwell is trying to scare us. It's working, she whispered. She looked away, staring at the poster on her wall. Sometimes I wish I had just let Harrison copy the project. It was just a grade. If I had just given him the stupid paper, none of this would be happening. That hit me harder than the lawsuit. The idea that she was internalizing the blame, that she thought protecting her integrity was a mistake because of the punishment these rich cowards were inflicting on us. I walked over and sat on the floor next to her. Listen to me, I said, waiting until she looked me in the eye. What happened to you was a crime. What they are doing now is bullying. If you had given him that paper, he would have learned that he can take whatever he wants from people like us. We don't bend, Maya. We don't let them buy their way out of being decent human beings. Even if it ruins us? She asked. We aren't ruined, I said. We're just in the middle of the fight, but the fight was getting incredibly lonely. The social isolation was almost worse than the financial strain. Bethesda is a small town when you run in certain circles. Sarah had been part of a local community garden project for 3 years. The week after the lawsuit hit, the local papers conveniently leaked by Caldwell's PR firm, framing me as an overzealous bureaucrat on a witch hunt. Sarah went to the weekend planting meeting. She came home an hour early, her face flushed red. They asked me to step down from the board, she said, dropping her gardening gloves on the counter. Susan Higgins. Her husband owns the dealership that supplies Hawthorne's driver's ed cars. She said my presence was creating an uncomfortable atmosphere. I walked over and put my arms around her. She leaned into me, trembling slightly. I'm so sorry, Sarah. Don't apologize for doing the right thing, Arthur, she said, her voice muffled against my shoulder. Just promise me we're going to win. I promise, I said, but I needed leverage. The IRS case was moving at the speed of government, meaning it could be 18 months before Caldwell ever saw a courtroom. I didn't have 18 months. I had about 30 days before the bank started proceedings on our home. I needed to break Caldwell's foundation right now. I spent the next 3 nights in the basement, fueled by cheap coffee and stubbornness, going through the mirrored hard drives from Hawthorne again. The IRS had the smoking gun on the tax fraud, but Caldwell's lawyers were building a firewall, claiming Caldwell was just a hands-off board member and Sterling was a rogue actor. I needed proof that Caldwell was directly managing the money. At 4 a.m. on a Thursday, I found a discrepancy in the email logs. It wasn't an encrypted file. It wasn't a secret code. It was a mundane, boring calendar invite. 3 years ago, on the exact date the shell company was incorporated in Delaware, Wallace Sterling had a calendar entry marked simply Meeting, RC, Golf Club, Endowment, Allocation. Standard stuff, but attached to that calendar invite was a PDF of the meeting agenda. I opened it. Item number 4 read, Discussion of vendor contracts for the new science wing, RC, to provide list of preferred contractors. I cross-referenced the list of contractors who actually built the science wing. Every single one of them was a subsidiary of the same Delaware holding company Caldwell used to siphon the funds. Caldwell didn't just know about the fraud. He designed it. He used his position on the board to force the school to hire his own fake companies to build a building with state money. It was a total conflict of interest, a direct violation of the board's charter, and absolute proof of premeditated fraud. I printed the document. It was 1 page. One stupid, boring page of a meeting agenda, but in my hands, it felt like a sledgehammer. I didn't call the police. I didn't call the IRS. They were already moving too slow. I called the one person who could make Richard Caldwell feel the exact same kind of pressure he was putting on my family. I called the senior editor of the Washington Post's investigative desk. Arthur Vance, the editor, a woman named Carla, said when she picked up. I was wondering when you were going to call. Your name has been floating around the newsroom. Caldwell's PR guys have been pitching us a story about your unhinged vendetta. I have a counter pitch, I said, staring at the printed agenda. How about a story on how the chairman of the board of the most prestigious private school in Maryland used state taxpayer grants to pay himself $4 million through Delaware shell companies, and then sued the state investigator who caught him? Silence on the line. Then, do you have the paper trail? I have the internal meeting agendas, the routing numbers, and the state grant applications. I can give you the entire package. Exclusive. Why are you giving this to me instead instead of the DA? Carla asked. Her tone was sharp, skeptical. The DA has it. The IRS has it. But Caldwell is using civil courts to starve me out before they can indict him. I need this in the sunlight, today. Bring it in, she said. If the documents verify, we can run it in the Sunday edition. I hung up the phone. I felt a brief surge of triumph, but it was quickly overshadowed by a gnawing anxiety. Going to the press was the nuclear option. It meant I could never go back to my job as a quiet, behind-the-scenes investigator. It meant putting my face and my family's name into the public meat grinder. But Caldwell had left me no choice. On Sunday morning, the story dropped. It was on the front page of the Metro section. The headline was massive. Elite Academy Board Chair implicated in $4M state grant fraud. The article was devastating. Carla hadn't just published the facts. She had painted a vivid picture of the sheer arrogance of the scheme. She detailed the shell companies, the inflated contractor invoices, and the direct link to Caldwell. And, most importantly, she framed my suspension and the massive lawsuit against me not as a legitimate legal grievance, but as a desperate, heavy-handed attempt to silence a public servant. I sat at the kitchen table, reading the article on my phone while drinking my coffee. Sarah was looking out the window at the street. There are news vans out there, she said quietly. I stood up and looked. 2 white vans with local news logos were parked across the street. A reporter with a microphone was standing on the sidewalk, looking at our house. My phone started ringing. It was an unfamiliar number. I let it go to voicemail. Then it rang again and again. I finally picked it up. Vance, you arrogant son of a bitch, a voice hissed. It was Richard Caldwell. The smooth, wealthy confidence was completely gone from his voice. He sounded cornered. He sounded frantic. Good morning, Richard. Did you read the paper? I asked. You think this changes anything? He spat. You think a newspaper article is going to save your house? My lawyers are drafting an addendum to the suit right now. Slander. Libel. We're going to take your pension. We're going to take everything. You don't have any lawyers drafting anything today, Richard, I said, my voice dead calm. Because your lawyers work for your companies. And right now, every single one of those companies is radioactive. Your board of directors is going to demand your resignation by noon to save their own skin. The state grant committee is going to file a motion to claw back the funds tomorrow morning. You're bleeding out, and you're screaming at the guy who holds the scalpel. I will ruin you, he breathed. You already tried, I said, and I'm still here. I hung up and turned my phone off. I walked into the living room. Maya was sitting on the couch, watching the news coverage on the TV. They were showing file footage of Hawthorne Academy, followed by a picture of Richard Caldwell walking into a gala. She looked up at me. Is he going to jail now? Eventually, I said, sitting down next to her. But the world knows what he is now. That's the first step. The next few days were a whirlwind of noise. Caldwell resigned from the board on Tuesday under immense pressure. On Thursday, a judge reviewed the Washington Post's reporting, looked at the sudden federal interest in Caldwell's finances, and quietly dissolved the emergency freeze on my bank accounts. The defamation suit was still technically active, but without Caldwell's money funding the legal team, it was dying on the vine. We could pay the mortgage, we could buy groceries, we could breathe, but the victory felt strange. It wasn't a clean, cinematic wrap-up. My career was still in limbo. My boss had sent a very tense email asking for a meeting with HR to discuss my unauthorized communication with the press. I was probably going to have to resign, or fight a lengthy bureaucratic battle to keep a job I wasn't sure I wanted anymore. Friday afternoon, I drove to the public high school to pick Maya up. I waited in the parking lot, watching the kids stream out of the double doors. It was loud, chaotic, and messy. There were no tailored blazers or antique rowing trophies, just teenagers trying to survive the week. Maya walked out, talking to a girl with bright purple hair. Maya was smiling, a real, unburdened smile. She waved goodbye to the girl and jogged over to the Honda, tossing her backpack into the back seat. How was it? I asked as she buckled her seatbelt. Good, she said. The robotics club is actually really intense. We're building a pneumatic lift for the competition next month. That's great, I said, putting the car in drive. As we pulled out of the parking lot, my phone buzzed in the cup holder. I glanced down. It was an email from a law firm in Washington, D.C. I didn't recognize the name. I waited until we were at a red light to open it. It was a formal notice of representation, not from Caldwell. It was from a group of parents at Hawthorne Academy, 7 families. I read the first paragraph, and the cold knot returned to my stomach. They weren't suing me. They were retaining counsel to demand a full state investigation into the disciplinary records I had seized during the audit. The email stated that, in light of the Caldwell revelations, they had reason to believe the school administration had actively covered up a string of assaults, hazing incidents, and academic fraud over the past decade, heavily favoring the children of major donors. They wanted me to lead the inquiry. The light turned green. I hit the gas, staring at the road ahead. We had taken down the man at the top, but the rot at Hawthorne Elite Academy went much, much deeper than one rich man and a desperate headmaster. The institution itself was built on a foundation of buried secrets, and the people who had been hurt were finally realizing that the door was unlocked. I looked at Maya, who was happily explaining the mechanics of a pneumatic cylinder. Caldwell was just the beginning. The real audit was about to start. I didn't reply to the email right away. I locked my screen and tossed the phone into the center console. Maya kept talking about air pressure and valves all the way to our driveway, her hands gesturing wildly as she explained the lift capacity of their robot. It was the most I'd heard her speak in a single stretch since the retreat. When we walked through the front door, the house smelled like roasted garlic and onions. Sarah was at the stove, stirring a pot of sauce, a glass of red wine sitting on the counter beside her. The stack of mail next to the sink was just grocery flyers and a water bill. Normalcy. After the last month, it felt heavier than the crisis. I kissed Sarah on the cheek, helped Maya set the table, and we ate dinner like a family that hadn't just been through a war. It wasn't until after 9 p.m., when Maya was upstairs in her room doing math homework, that I brought my phone into the living room and handed it to Sarah. She was sitting on the sofa, folding laundry. She wiped her hands on her jeans, took the phone, and read the email from the parent's lawyer. I watched the relief of the last 48 hours drain right out of her shoulders. She read it twice, then gently set the phone face down on the coffee table. Tell me you're not going to answer that, she said. Her voice wasn't angry. It was exhausted. 7 families, Sarah. 7 kids who went through what Maya went through, or worse, and Sterling covered it up. They want my help organizing the paper trail. And the police have the paper trail now, she said, leaning forward. The DA has the hard drives. The IRS has the financial records. It's out of our hands. You know how the DA works, I said, keeping my voice low so it wouldn't carry up the stairs. They're going to prosecute the financial fraud because it's a slam dunk. They're going to squeeze Caldwell for the state grant money. But the disciplinary files, the hazing, the assaults, they'll negotiate that away in a plea deal to save court time. They always do. Those kids won't get anything but a generic apology letter from an interim board. Sarah looked at me, her eyes shining with unshed tears. We barely survived this week, Arthur. They froze our accounts. They tried to take our house. Maya is is finally sleeping through the night without waking up shivering. We won. Caldwell is gone. Sterling is ruined. Let it be enough. I sat down next to her and took her hand. It was warm. I thought about the rusted deadbolt on that maintenance shed. I thought about Harrison Caldwell's face when he admitted he just forgot she was in there. If I walk away now, I said quietly, I'm telling Maya that we only fight when it's our own blood on the line. I'm telling her that once we're safe, the other kids can fend for themselves. Sarah pulled her hand back, just an inch, but it felt like a mile. I'm not asking you to be selfish. I'm asking you to be a father first and a crusader second. If you drag us back into that school's orbit, Caldwell's friends on the board will find another way to come after us. They have money, Arthur. We have a 10-year-old Honda and a mortgage. She stood up, grabbed the laundry basket, and walked upstairs. I sat in the quiet living room for a long time. She was right. Every logical, protective instinct I had told me she was right. But the investigator in me, the guy who spent 5 years tracking missing state funds through the muddy waters of private education, knew that corruption like Hawthorne's didn't exist in a vacuum. Sterling didn't build that system alone. It took a village of wealthy, compliant adults to maintain an environment where teenagers could torture each other without consequence. On Monday morning, I put on my one decent suit and drove downtown to the Department of Education. I hadn't been in the building since the emergency review of my department was announced, then quietly rescinded when Caldwell's empire caught fire in the press. My badge still worked at the turnstile. The security guard at the front desk gave me a tight, uncomfortable nod. As I walked through the cubicles to my desk, the silence in the room was deafening. People looked away, suddenly intensely interested in their monitors. I was the guy who blew the whistle to the Washington Post. I was radioactive. I didn't even make it to my chair before my desk phone rang. It was David, the director of the department. Arthur, my office. Now, David's office was on the corner, overlooking the harbor. He was a career bureaucrat, a man who had survived 4 different governors by never, ever making waves. He was standing behind his desk, wearing a pastel blue tie and a forced smile that didn't reach his eyes. Next to him was a woman I didn't recognize. Sharp suit, legal pad, HR written all over her. Sit down, Art, David said, gesturing to one of the uncomfortable leather chairs. I didn't sit. What's this about, David? The budget review was dropped. I'm back on the clock. Yes, you are, he said, clearing his throat. And I want to commend you. The Hawthorne situation, well, it was a mess. But you rooted out a massive misuse of state funds. The governor's office is actually very pleased with the optics. Catching rich fraudsters plays well in an election year. I'm sensing a butt coming, I said. The HR woman spoke up. Her voice was pure corporate Teflon. Mr. Vance, your decision to circumvent internal reporting structures and leak active investigative details to the Washington Post was a severe violation of department protocol. My department's funding was magically frozen the morning after I served Hawthorne with a subpoena. I fired back. The internal reporting structure was bought and paid for by Richard Caldwell. I went to the press because you were trying to bury me to protect him. David held up a hand. Let's not rehash the past. We're here to talk about the future. The board at Hawthorne has been entirely restructured over the weekend. They've brought in a crisis management firm, a new interim headmaster, and they are fully cooperating with the state to return the stolen grant money. It's a clean slate. I stared at him. A clean slate. They've been covering up student abuse for 10 years, David. I have the files, which you will immediately turn over to the state prosecutor's office, and then you will close your case file, David said, his tone shifting from conciliatory to an absolute command. You are done with Hawthorne. We are officially reassigning you to the Western Maryland district. We need a comprehensive audit of the rural bus routing contracts. It's a massive project. It will take you out of Bethesda entirely for the next 6 months. I let out a short, harsh laugh. You're sending me to the middle of nowhere to count bus tires. We are offering you a lateral move with a 10% pay bump to let this go, David corrected. If you refuse the reassignment, HR will formally discipline you for the press leak, which means immediate termination, loss of pension, and a permanent black mark on your state record. He wasn't protecting Caldwell anymore. Caldwell was a liability. David was protecting the Department of Education. He was protecting himself. If I dug into a decade of abuses at Hawthorne, it would inevitably lead to questions about why the state had been funneling millions of dollars in grants to a school with such a toxic, unregulated culture. It would show that our department had been asleep at the wheel, rubber stamping applications because the parents at the school threw nice fundraisers. You want me to walk away from 7 families whose kids were victimized? I said, my voice dangerously quiet. I want you to do your job, David said. Your job is financial oversight. You are not Batman, Arthur. You're an accountant with a badge. The rural bus audit starts tomorrow. Leave your current files with legal. I looked at the HR woman, who was already writing something on her legal pad. I looked at David, who was sweating through his expensive shirt despite the air conditioning. I reached into my pocket, pulled out my gold investigator badge, and dropped it on his desk. It landed with a heavy, satisfying thud right next to his Mont Blanc pen. I resign, I said. David blinked, genuinely shocked. Arthur, don't be an idiot. You're 5 years out from a full pension. You have a mortgage. You have a kid. You can't just throw away a state career over a crusade. Watch me, I said. I turned around and walked out of the office. I didn't stop at my desk. I didn't pack up my mugs or my framed photos. I just walked straight to the elevator, rode it down to the lobby, and walked out into the bright Monday sunlight. By the time I got to my car, the adrenaline started to fade, replaced by a cold, creeping panic. Sarah was going to kill me. She had begged me to drop it to save our finances, and I had just thrown away my salary, my health insurance, and my pension in a 30-second conversation. I sat in the driver's seat, my hands resting on the steering wheel, trying to slow my breathing. I pulled my phone out of the console and opened the email from the lawyer representing the Hawthorne families. I hit reply. I'm no longer with the state, but I'm in. Where do we meet? An hour later, I was sitting in a booth at a Panera Bread a few miles from the Hawthorne campus. It was lunchtime, the place packed with office workers eating overpriced salads. Across from me sat a woman named Elena Rostova. She looked to be in her late 40s, wearing a faded cardigan and clutching a canvas tote bag like it was a life preserver. She was the mother who had organized the group. She didn't order any food, just a black coffee that she hadn't touched. She reached into her tote bag and pulled out a thick 3-ring binder. She slid it across the table toward me. My son's name is Leo, she said. Her voice had a slight tremor, but her eyes were locked onto mine, fiercely present. He was at Hawthorne 2 years ago. He was a scholarship student, played the cello. I rested my hand on the binder. I didn't open it yet. What happened to Leo, Elena? He didn't fit in, she said, wrapping both hands around her paper coffee cup. The lacrosse boys, Harrison Caldwell's older brother, was the captain. Then, they made it their mission to break him. They destroyed his instrument in the locker room. They locked him in the showers after turning off the hot water. They sent him anonymous messages telling him his mother was a charity case. She took a ragged breath. I went to Headmaster Sterling. I brought him the text messages. I brought him the repair bill for the cello. Sterling told me that Leo was lacking the emotional emotional fortitude for Hawthorne. He told me the destruction of the cello was a locker room accident. 2 weeks later, they revoked Leo's scholarship, citing a sudden drop in his grades. My son had a nervous breakdown. He spent a month in a residential psychiatric facility. He still flinches when his phone buzzes. I opened the binder. It was meticulously organized. Printed emails, screenshots of text messages, medical bills, and formal letters from the Hawthorne administration, filled with the same slippery, gaslighting corporate speak Sterling had tried to use on me. I saw the news about your daughter, Elena said softly. I saw what you did to Caldwell. You're the first person who ever made them bleed. That's why we need you, Mr. Vance. The lawyer we hired says we have a civil case, but without someone who knows how to tear apart their internal records, they'll just stonewall us until we run out of money. I don't have my badge anymore, Elena. I told her, needing to be completely honest. I just quit. I can't subpoena their servers. I can't force them to hand over hard drives. We don't need subpoenas, she said, leaning closer. The crisis management firm Hawthorne hired, they're trying to put out the fire before it spreads. They sent an email to all the victim families yesterday. She flipped to the very back of the binder and pointed to a fresh printout. It was a letter from a high-end DC law firm representing Hawthorne's new interim board. I read it quickly. It was a settlement offer. The school was offering to completely refund the tuition of every affected family, plus a lump sum of $50,000 for emotional distress. It was a massive payout, hundreds of thousands of dollars. But there was a catch, right there in the third paragraph. Acceptance of this restitution is contingent upon the signing of a comprehensive non-disclosure agreement. Signatories will agree to permanently withdraw any pending civil litigation, refrain from discussing their tenure at Hawthorne Academy with any media or law enforcement personnel, and surrender all physical and digital evidence pertaining to their claims to the Academy's legal representatives. They're trying to buy your silence, I said, feeling a familiar disgust rise in my throat. They're trying to buy the evidence, Elena corrected. And it's working. 3 of the 7 families have already told me they're going to take the deal. They're tired, Arthur. They have medical bills. $50,000 is a lot of money when your kid is in therapy 3 days a week. If they sign that NDA, Hawthorne buries this forever, I said. The new board gets to pretend they cleaned house, and the culture that allowed it to happen stays exactly the same, which is why I need you to find the rot before Friday, she said. The offer expires at the end of the week. If you can't find proof that the new board is just as complicit as the old one, that this settlement is just hush money to protect the current donors, the coalition will collapse. The families will sign, and it's over. I looked at the binder. I looked at the panicked, desperate hope in Elena's eyes. I had 4 days to dismantle an institution's cover-up as a private citizen, with no salary, a wife who was already at her breaking point, and a mortgage hanging over my head. Leave the binder, I said. She pushed the heavy plastic spine across the table. It slid until it hit my knuckles. Elena didn't say anything else. She just picked up her untouched coffee, stood up, and walked out of the Panera, blending into the lunchtime crowd of people who were just having a normal Monday. I took the binder out to the car. I didn't open it yet. I put it on the passenger seat, right where Maya had been sitting an hour earlier, and drove home. The house was empty. Sarah was at her part-time shift at the library, and Maya was at school. The silence in the kitchen felt heavy, expectant, like the air right before a thunderstorm breaks. I put the binder on the kitchen island, made a pot of coffee, and sat down on a bar stool. I stared at the white cover for 20 minutes before I finally flipped it open. Elena wasn't exaggerating. The level of meticulous documentation was staggering. It wasn't just Leo's case. There were tabs for 6 other students. A sophomore girl whose locker was repeatedly vandalized with slurs after she reported a senior for groping her at a school-sponsored car wash. The administration's response was to require her times to attend mediation sessions with her abuser to foster community understanding. A junior boy who was locked in the unventilated equipment room under the bleachers for 3 hours during a heat wave by the varsity wrestling team. He passed out from heat exhaustion. The school nurse's log, which Elena had somehow gotten a copy of, recorded it as a fainting spell due to skipping breakfast. Every tab followed the exact same pattern. An incident of vicious, targeted abuse, a desperate plea from the parents, a meeting with Wallace Sterling or the dean of students, and then the paper trail of institutional gaslighting. The letters from the school were masterpieces of corporate deflection. They used words like misunderstanding, adolescent friction, and lack of cultural fit. They never punished the aggressors. They slowly, systematically squeezed the victims until the families either withdrew their children quietly or were forced out by sudden, unexplained revocations of financial aid. And in every single case, the primary aggressor was the child of a family that had donated more than $100,000 to the Hawthorne Endowment. It was an economy of abuse. The school sold immunity to the highest bidders, and the currency was the mental and physical well-being of the kids who didn't have the last names or the bank accounts to fight back. I was halfway through the 4th tab when I heard the front door unlock. Sarah walked in, dropping her keys into the ceramic bowl by the door. She was carrying a bag of groceries. She stopped when she saw me sitting at the island, still in my suit, at 2 in the afternoon. "Did you get off early?" she asked, setting the bag on the counter. Then she saw the thick white binder sitting open in front of me. She recognized Elena's handwriting on the tabs, the color completely drained from her face. "Arthur," she said, her voice dropping to a whisper, "tell me you brought that home to scan it for the police." "The police aren't going to look at this, Sarah," I said, keeping my voice as steady as I could. "The DA is building a financial case. They don't care about a kid whose cello was smashed 2 years ago. They don't care about the girl who had to switch schools because she was harassed. They care about the $4 million. She gripped the edge of the counter. "You promised me. Last night, you sat on that couch and you told me we were done." "I went to work today," I said, closing the binder. "David pulled me into his office with HR. They offered me a 10% raise to move to a bus routing audit in Western Maryland. They explicitly told me to drop Hawthorne, to hand over my files, and to look the other way. The state isn't going to investigate the school's culture. They're going to let the new interim board sweep it all under the rug." Sarah stared at me. Her chest was rising and falling quickly. "So you took the reassignment, right? You took the raise. It's an hour commute, but we can manage that. We need the money." I looked down at my hands. I resigned, Sarah. The silence that followed was the loudest thing I've ever heard in my life. The refrigerator hummed. A car drove by outside. "You quit," she stated. It wasn't a question. If I took that reassignment, I was agreeing to let them bury this, I said, standing up. I stepped toward her, wanting to bridge the physical gap, but she put a hand up, stopping me dead in my tracks. "We lose our health insurance at the end of the month," she said, her voice eerily calm. "Maya has follow-up appointments for the nerve damage in her fingers. We have a mortgage payment in 14 days. The bank just unfroze our accounts last week, Arthur. We have exactly $4,000 in checking, and you quit your job. I'll find another job, a private firm, consulting, anything. I have the resume for it." "When?" she snapped, the calmness cracking. "Between your pro bono investigations? Between your secret meetings at Panera? You didn't resign for us, Arthur. Arthur. You didn't do this to protect your family. You did it because you can't stand the idea of someone else winning. You did it for your own ego. That's not true, I said, but the words felt hollow in my mouth. Isn't it? She asked, tears finally spilling over her eyelashes. She didn't bother to wipe them away. Maya is trying to move on. She joined a robotics club. She made a friend. She just wants to be a normal teenager who doesn't have a news van parked outside her house. And here you are, dragging the monster right back to our front door. Sarah, the school is offering these families a $50,000 settlement attached to an ironclad NDA. If they sign it by Friday, Hawthorne gets away with all of it. They get to keep operating the exact same way. Another kid is going to get locked in a shed, or worse. Then let someone else save them, she screamed. It was the first time in 15 years of marriage I had ever heard her scream. It shocked both of us. She covered her mouth with her hand, taking a jagged breath. She turned away from me and walked to the closet. She pulled out her small weekend duffel bag. What are you doing? I asked, a cold spike of panic hitting my chest. I'm going to my sister's house in Silver Spring, she said, pulling a few sweaters from the hall closet and shoving them into the bag. I can't be here right now. I can't look at you right now. Sarah, please, don't do this. I need to think, Arthur, she said, zipping the bag. I need to figure out how I'm going to pay for my daughter's physical therapy because my husband decided to play savior for everyone else's kids instead of taking care of his own. She picked up her keys from the bowl. She didn't look at me again. The front door clicked shut, and a minute later, I heard her car back out of the driveway. I stood in the kitchen for a long time. The house felt massive and empty. I looked at the white binder on the island. I wanted to throw it in the trash. I wanted to burn it. I wanted to call David, beg for my job back, and take the bus routing audit, but I didn't. I opened the binder to the next tab and kept reading. By the time Maya got home at 4:30, I had moved my operation to the dining room table. I had printed out the public biographies of every single member of the newly formed interim board at Hawthorne Academy. I was cross-referencing their corporate affiliations with the donor lists Elena had provided. Maya walked in, dropping her backpack by the door. She looked around. Where's Mom? She went to Aunt Karen's for a few days, I said, keeping my eyes on the paperwork so she wouldn't see the guilt I knew was written all over my face. She needed a break. Things had been stressful. Maya didn't say anything. She walked into the dining room and looked at the sea of paper covering the table. She looked at the white binder. She saw the Hawthorne logo printed on several of the documents. She pulled out a chair and sat down slowly. I thought it was over. The financial part is, I told her gently. The police have Caldwell, but some other families reached out to me. Kids who were hurt before you. The school is trying to pay them off to keep them quiet. Maya picked up a highlighter from the table. She turned it over in her hands, tracing the plastic edge. Mom didn't go to Aunt Karen's for a break, did she? She left because you won't let this go. Kids are always smarter than you think they are. Your mom and I just had a disagreement on how to handle things, I said. It's going to be fine, Maya. Why are you doing this? She asked. She looked up at me, and her eyes were so tired. I'm okay, Dad. I'm really okay. I don't want you to ruin our lives just to punish them. I'm not doing it to punish them, I said. I'm doing it because they're using NDAs to hide a decade of abuse. If they succeed, they'll just keep doing it. But why does it have to be you? She asked, her voice cracking. You're not a cop. You're not even a state investigator anymore, are you? That's why Mom left. I swallowed hard. I resigned this morning. They wanted me to drop the investigation. Maya put the highlighter down carefully. She stood up. You shouldn't have done that. She walked upstairs, and a moment later, I heard her bedroom door click shut. I was entirely alone. I had alienated my wife, disappointed my daughter, and thrown away my career, all for a white binder full of other people's trauma. I spent the next 2 days in a manic blur of research. Without my state databases, I was relegated to public records, LinkedIn profiles, corporate registry sites, and old newspaper archives. I slept for maybe 3 hours a night on the living room sofa. The Hawthorne crisis management firm had done a brilliant job making the new interim board look like a breath of fresh air. They appointed a former public school superintendent as the interim headmaster. They brought in an ethics professor from Georgetown to oversee the grievance committee. They issued public statements about transparency and healing. But the deeper I dug into the actual board members, the people who controlled the endowment and made the final decisions, the more the illusion fell apart. The new chairman of the board was a man named Thomas Vance, no relation to me. He was a senior partner at a massive corporate law firm in D.C. I spent 4 hours tracing Thomas Vance's corporate history. He didn't seem to have any direct ties to Richard Caldwell's shell companies. He looked clean. But at 2 a.m. on Wednesday, I finally found the connection. It wasn't financial. It was social. I found a digitized copy of an old country club newsletter from 8 years ago. It featured a photo of a charity golf tournament. Standing next to Richard Caldwell, holding a silver trophy and smiling for the camera, was Thomas Vance. The caption listed them as the co-chairs of the club's membership committee. I kept digging. I found property records. Vance and Caldwell owned adjacent vacation homes in the Outer Banks. They served on the board of the same private charity foundation. The new board wasn't a cleansing of the old guard. It was a lateral pass. Caldwell had resigned, but he had simply handed the keys to his best friend and golfing buddy to ensure the machine kept running and the secrets stayed buried. The $50,000 settlement offer wasn't a gesture of goodwill. It was Vance using the school's money to buy a fire blanket for Caldwell's legacy. I had the connection, but it wasn't illegal to be friends with a fraudster. I needed proof that Vance was actively obstructing justice in his new role as chairman. On Wednesday morning, my phone rang. It was Elena. Arthur, she said. She sounded like she had been crying. We lost the Millers. What do you mean? They signed the NDA this morning, she said, her voice shaking. Their youngest needs a specialized reading tutor. The school district won't cover it. The $50,000. They couldn't turn it down. Hawthorne's lawyers messaged the rest of us an hour ago. They told us the offer is being pulled tomorrow at 5 p.m. instead of Friday. They know we're fracturing. They're accelerating the timeline. Elena, don't sign anything, I said, rubbing my burning eyes. I found the link. The new chairman is Caldwell's closest associate. This whole settlement is a sham to protect the old administration. A photo of them playing golf isn't going to hold this coalition together, Arthur, she said sharply. The Changs are talking about signing tonight. If they go, the rest will follow. We need hard proof that the new board is corrupt, or we have to take the money. I can't ask these people to bankrupt themselves on principle. Give me 24 hours, I said. You have until tomorrow afternoon, she replied, and hung up. I stared at my laptop screen. I had 24 hours to prove that a high-powered DC attorney was actively participating in a cover-up. I needed internal communications. I needed to see what Vance was saying to the crisis management team behind closed doors. But I didn't have a subpoena. I didn't have a badge. I realized then that if I was going to do this, I had to cross a line I had never crossed in my entire career. I had to stop playing by the rules. I grabbed my keys and drove to the one place I swore I'd never go back to, Hawthorne Elite Academy. I didn't drive through the main gates. I parked my Honda a half-mile down the road at a public park and walked through the woods that bordered the campus. It was noon. The students were in classes or at lunch. I stuck to the tree line, feeling ridiculous and terrified in my windbreaker and jeans, until I reached the back of the maintenance wing. I wasn't there to break into an office. I didn't know how to pick a lock, and I wasn't about to commit a felony burglary. I was looking for a person. I waited behind a row of industrial dumpsters for 45 minutes. Finally, the heavy metal door of the maintenance shed opened. A man in gray coveralls walked out, carrying a plastic bin of empty chemical bottles. He was older, maybe 60, with a thick gray mustache and a weary stoop to his shoulders. It was the night shift janitor, the guy whose forgotten keys had saved my daughter's life. I knew he worked split shifts on Wednesdays. I stepped out from behind the dumpster. He jumped, dropping the plastic bin. The empty bottles clattered across the asphalt. He looked at me, his eyes wide with alarm, and took a step back toward the door. "Mr. Hernandez?" I asked, holding my hands up to show I wasn't a threat. I had seen his name in the police report. "You're not supposed to be back here," he said, his accent thick. He looked around nervously. "Campus security will call the police." "I know," I said, keeping my voice low and calm. "I'm Arthur Vance, Maya's father, the girl in the shed." His posture changed instantly. The fear drained out of him, replaced by a profound, heavy sorrow. He looked down at the ground. "Your daughter. I am so glad she is okay. I think about that night, every night. If I had not forgotten my thermos." "You saved her life, Marcus," I said, using his first name. "And I never got to thank you." "I didn't do anything brave," he muttered, picking up the fallen bottles. "I just opened a door." "I need you to open another one for me," I said. He stopped and looked up at me. "The school is trying to buy off the other families," I explained quickly. "The new board is destroying the records of what happened to those kids. I need to know what they're throwing away." Marcus shook his head vigorously. No, I can't get involved. I need this job. My wife has medical bills." The new headmaster, he sent an email to all staff. "Anyone talking to outsiders is fired immediately." "Marcus, please. They're going to get away with all of it. All the things you've seen happen to those kids over the years." "I just clean the floors," he said, turning back to the door. "Do you?" I asked, my voice hardening just a fraction. "You empty the trash in the administrative offices. You're the one who cleans out the shredder bins. You're the one who empties the recycling." He froze, his hand on the heavy metal door handle. "The crisis management firm has been in the boardroom for 3 days," I said. "They're generating hundreds of pages of physical documents, drafts of settlements, strategy memos. They think nobody cares about paper anymore. But they're lawyers. They print everything, and then they throw the drafts away." I walked closer to him. "I don't need you to steal anything. I just need to know where the recycling from the executive boardroom goes before the municipal trucks pick it up on Fridays." Marcus stared at me. His jaw worked silently. He looked at the main building, a sprawling brick monument to wealth and privilege, and then he looked back at me. I saw the resentment in his eyes, the quiet, simmering anger of a man who spent his life cleaning up the messes of arrogant people who didn't even know his name. "The secure shredding company comes on Fridays," Marcus whispered, not looking at me. "But the regular paper recycling, the drafts, the memos they don't think are important enough to shred, that goes into the blue industrial bins behind the cafeteria loading dock." He opened the door to the maintenance bay. "The dock is blind to the security cameras," he added softly. "The cameras point at the parking lot, not the bins. The gate is unlocked from 3 p.m. to 4 p.m. for the food delivery trucks." He stepped inside and pulled the door shut behind him. I looked at my watch. It was 1:15 p.m. I walked back through the woods to my car. I sat in the driver's seat, my heart hammering against my ribs. Dumpster diving on private property. It was trespassing. It was exactly the kind of desperate, unhinged behavior Caldwell's PR team had accused me of. If I got caught, the police wouldn't care about my righteous cause. They'd arrest me for prowling around a school. I thought about Sarah sitting at her sister's house, wondering if her husband had lost his mind. I thought about Maya, wanting to just be normal. Then I thought about Elena's son, Leo, flinching every time his phone buzzed. At 3:15 p.m., I drove the Honda around to the rear service road of Hawthorne Academy. I pulled up right behind a massive Cisco food delivery truck that was idling at the loading dock. 2 cafeteria workers were busy unloading pallets of frozen vegetables. I got out of the car, grabbed a handful of heavy-duty black trash bags from my trunk, and walked casually toward the blue industrial recycling bins lined up against the brick wall. I kept my head down, moving with the purposeful stride of someone who belonged there. There were 4 bins. I flipped the lid on the first one, cardboard boxes. The second one, empty milk cartons and plastic wrap. The third one, it was full to the brim with loose paper, office paper, crinkled, torn, and heavily printed. I didn't sort through it. I didn't have time. I just started grabbing massive armfuls of paper and shoving them into my black trash bags. I moved frantically, the sharp edges of the paper slicing into my cuticles. My breath was loud in my own ears. I kept waiting for a shout, for a hand to grab my shoulder. I filled 3 black bags in less than 2 minutes. I tied them off, hauled them to the trunk of my Honda, slammed it shut, and got behind the wheel. I put the car in drive and pulled away just as one of the cafeteria workers looked up from his clipboard. I drove exactly the speed limit all the way home. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely hold the steering wheel. I hauled the 3 bags into the dining room and dumped them out onto the floor. It was a mountain of paper, thousands of pages. Most of it was useless lunch menus, draft schedules, internal HR memos about parking spaces. I sat on the floor and started sorting. By 9 p.m., my back was screaming. My hands were covered in ink stains and paper cuts, and I had a pile of about 200 pages that seemed relevant to the crisis management team. At 11:30 p.m., I found the first piece of the puzzle. It was a printed email chain. It wasn't shredded because it wasn't an official legal document. It was a logistical exchange between an administrative assistant and the crisis firm. But halfway down the chain, there was a forwarded message from Thomas Vance, the new chairman. "Make sure the settlement language strictly prohibits the signatory families from communicating with the State Board of Education or any former investigators, specifically A. Vance. We need to isolate them before the DA expands the scope of the Caldwell inquiry." It was ugly, but it wasn't illegal. It was standard hardball legal tactics. It wouldn't be enough to hold the coalition together. I kept digging. The pile was getting smaller. At 2:15 a.m., I found a crumpled, coffee-stained document that made my breath catch in my throat. It was a draft of a budget allocation for the upcoming semester, stamped internal board review only. There was a line item under contingency funds. It read, "Restitution settlement payout, 7 families, $350,000. Next to that line item, someone had handwritten a note in blue ink. The handwriting was sharp, aggressive. "Pull this from the athletic facility grant overflow. The state won't audit the construction timeline until next year. By then, the NDA is locked, and we can backfill the grant from donor drives. T.V." I stared at the blue ink. T.V. Thomas Vance. He wasn't using the school's endowment to pay the settlements. He was taking the money from the exact same pool of state grant funds that Caldwell had been stealing from. He was illegally repurposing taxpayer money to pay hush money to abuse victims, to hide the fact that the school had failed them. It was a massive, undeniable undeniable violation of state law. It was fraud. Again, they were so arrogant, so used to playing fast and loose with the rules, that they didn't even bother to use clean money to buy their silence. I took out my phone and took a dozen high-resolution photos of the document, making sure the handwritten note was crystal clear. I looked at the clock. It was 3 a.m. on Thursday. The deadline was 14 hours away. I didn't wait. I drafted an email to Elena, attaching the photos. Subject: do not sign. Look at the attached. Body: Vance is using state grant money to fund the settlements. If the families take this money, they become accessories to the embezzlement scheme. They will be taking stolen taxpayer funds. The moment they sign, Hawthorne can use that to blackmail them into silence forever. Tell the Changs, tell everyone. The deal is poison. I hit send. Then I laid down on the floor, right in the middle of the sea of recycled paper, and passed out. I woke up to the sound of someone knocking loudly on the front door. I bolted upright, my spine cracking in protest. Sunlight was streaming through the dining room windows. I checked my phone. It was 8:30 a.m. I had 3 missed calls from Elena, and 1 text message. We saw the email. We are not signing. The coalition holds. What do we do now? The knocking at the door came again, louder this time. A sharp, authoritative rapping. I scrambled to my feet, brushing paper scraps off my jeans. I walked to the front door and looked through the peephole. It wasn't a police officer. It wasn't Sarah. It was a man in a very expensive, perfectly tailored navy suit. He was holding a leather briefcase. Standing behind him, on my front porch, was Thomas Vance. I unlocked the door and pulled it open, keeping my foot wedged behind the base so they couldn't push their way in. "Good morning, Arthur," Thomas Vance said. His voice was smooth, cultured, and dripping with condescension. He didn't look like a man whose cover-up had just been blown. He looked mildly annoyed, like he was dealing with a stray dog on his lawn. "Mr. Vance," I said, my voice hoarse from sleep. "To what do I owe the pleasure?" The lawyer next to him spoke up. "Mr. Vance, we are here on behalf of the Board of Trustees of Hawthorne Academy. We have reason to believe you are in possession of stolen proprietary documents belonging to the school." They knew. The crisis firm must have realized the drafts were missing, or the cafeteria workers had reported my license plate. "I don't know what you're talking about," I said, leaning against the doorframe. Thomas Vance sighed, a patronizing sound. "Let's dispense with the theater, Arthur. We know you were on campus yesterday. We know you went through the recycling bins. It's pathetic, frankly, but it's also theft of corporate property. Recycling is considered abandoned property under Maryland law." I countered smoothly, the old investigator instincts kicking in. "Once it hits the bin on the loading dock, it's public domain." The lawyer opened his mouth to argue, but Thomas held up a hand. "You think you found a smoking gun, Arthur. That little note about the athletic grant," Thomas said, his eyes narrowing. "Elena Rostova forwarded your email to our legal team this morning to formally reject the settlement, so we know exactly what you have." "Then you know you're finished," I said. "You're using stolen state funds to pay hush money. The DA is going to love that." Thomas laughed. It was a short, sharp bark. "You really don't understand how this works, do you? You think this is a movie where the plucky underdog catches the villain on a technicality?" He took a step closer to the door. "That document is a draft, Arthur, a brainstorming exercise. The funds haven't been moved. No crime has been committed. All you have is a piece of paper proving that I explored all financial avenues to resolve a difficult situation." He was right. Exploring a transfer isn't the same as executing one, but the intent was there. "But," Thomas continued, his voice dropping to a dangerous register, "what I have is a man who quit his job, who has no legal authority, trespassing on private property and harassing my staff. My lawyers spent the morning drafting a restraining order. It will be signed by a judge at noon. If you go within a mile of Hawthorne or attempt to contact any of its employees or board members, you will be arrested." He pulled a thick white envelope from his breast pocket and held it out to me. "And this," he said, "is a formal complaint we are filing with the Maryland State Police, accusing you of corporate espionage and extortion. We are claiming you stole those documents to blackmail the school into settling with those families so you could take a cut." I stared at the envelope. "That's a lie. I'm not taking a dime. Prove it in court," Thomas said with a cold smile. "Oh wait, you don't have a job to pay for a defense attorney, and your accounts are dangerously low." I read the bank liens from Richard's lawsuit. He pushed the envelope against my chest. I didn't take it. It fluttered to the porch floor. "I am offering you one final off-ramp, Arthur," Thomas said quietly. "You delete the photos. You tell Elena and the others that you made a mistake, that the document is meaningless. You tell them to take the $50,000, and in return this envelope goes in the shredder, and we forget you ever existed. And if I don't, then we destroy you," Thomas said simply. "We won't just take your house. We'll make sure you go to prison for extortion. We'll make sure your daughter's name is dragged through every deposition as the catalyst for her father's criminal breakdown. How is she going to like being the center of attention again?" He had found the one nerve I had left, and he pressed on it with surgical precision. "You have until 5 p.m., Thomas said. He turned and walked down the steps toward a waiting black car, the lawyer trailing behind him like a shadow. I closed the door and locked it. I slid down the wood until I was sitting on the floor of the entryway, staring at the mountain of trash paper in my dining room. He had me. He was right. I couldn't prove the money had actually moved. I had intent, but I didn't have a crime. And the threat of criminal extortion charges, backed by a multi-million-dollar legal team, would break me. I wouldn't just lose the house. I'd lose my freedom. Maya would lose her father. I pulled my phone out of my pocket. I dialed Sarah's sister's number. It rang 4 times before Sarah picked up. "Arthur?" she said. She sounded exhausted. "Sarah, I need you to come home." My voice broke. I couldn't stop it. "You were right. I can't win this. They're going to file criminal charges against me." There was a long silence on the line. I thought she might hang up. "I'm leaving now," she said. "I'll be there in 30 minutes." I spent the next half hour cleaning up the dining room. I shoved all the paper back into the black trash bags. I dragged them out to the garage. I wiped down the table. I tried to erase the evidence of my own failure. When Sarah walked through the door, she didn't look angry. She just looked sad. She saw the clean dining room table. She saw me sitting on the sofa, my head in my hands. She sat down next to me. "Tell me." I told her everything. The dumpster diving, the document, the visit from Thomas Vance, the threat of extortion charges. "I have to tell Elena to take the deal," I said, staring at the floor. "I have to tell those 7 families that I failed them. If I don't, I go to jail." Sarah reached out and took my hand. Her fingers were cold. "We fought as hard as we could, Arthur," she said softly. "You got Caldwell out. You protected Maya. You can't fix the whole world. It feels like I'm selling them out. You're saving us," she said. I nodded slowly. I pulled out my phone to call Elena. It was 11 a.m. I had 6 hours until the deadline. Just as I unlocked the screen, the phone vibrated in my hand. It was a text message, not from Elena. It was from an unknown number. "Mr. Vance, I am sitting in the parking lot of the public library on Elm Street. I have something you need. Come alone." I stared at the message. "Who is it?" Sarah asked, seeing my expression change. "I don't know," I said. "Spam, maybe." But the investigator in me knew it wasn't spam. The timing was too perfect. I looked at Sarah. "I have to go to the library. quickly. Arthur, no, stop. You just said it's over. It's 5 minutes away. If it's nothing, I'll call Elena the second I leave. I promise. I grabbed my keys and practically ran out the door. The Elm Street Library was a small brick building with a cramped parking lot. I pulled in and scanned the cars. There was a beige sedan parked in the far corner, away from the entrance. The engine was running. I parked next to it and got out. As I approached the passenger side, the tinted window rolled down halfway. Sitting in the driver's seat was a woman I recognized instantly. It was Wallace Sterling's secretary, the woman who had panicked on the phone the day I audited the school, the woman who sat outside his office and managed his calendar for 10 years. She looked terrified. She was gripping the steering wheel so tightly her knuckles were white. Mrs. Gable? I asked, leaning down slightly. Get in, she said, her voice shaking. I walked around and got into the passenger seat. The car smelled like stale coffee and nervous sweat. I shouldn't be here, she said, checking her rearview mirror. If they find out I talked to you, I'll lose my pension. Vance fired me yesterday. He said the new board needed a fresh start. 10 years of loyalty, and they threw me out with 2 weeks severance. I'm sorry, I said quietly. Sterling was a monster, she said, staring straight ahead. But Vance is worse. Sterling did it for the prestige. Vance does it for the control. I saw the news. I saw what you're trying to do for those families. She reached into her purse and pulled out a small black USB drive. They made me wipe the servers, she whispered. Before the crisis team even arrived, Vance ordered me to permanently delete the entire disciplinary review archive. Every complaint, every internal memo, every payoff from the last 10 years. She looked at me, her eyes wet with tears. But I'm a secretary, Mr. Vance. I've survived 3 headmasters because I know that you never, ever delete the only copy of your leverage. She pressed the flash drive into my palm. It was warm. That's the unedited archive, she said. It's not just the 7 families. It's everyone. And it includes the internal emails between Vance and Sterling authorizing the destruction of evidence yesterday. My heart stopped. Authorization of destruction of evidence? I asked. In writing, she confirmed. Vance used his law firm email to direct the purge. He thought it was protected by attorney-client privilege, but he's acting as the board chair, not their legal counsel. The privilege doesn't apply. She put the car in gear. You need to get out now. I'm leaving the state to stay with my daughter in Ohio. Don't ever tell anyone where you got this. I scrambled out of the car. She peeled out of the parking lot before I even had the door fully shut. I stood on the asphalt, staring at the small black piece of plastic in my hand. Thomas Vance thought he had me backed into a corner with a draft document and a threat of extortion. He thought he had outplayed me. He didn't realize that arrogance creates enemies everywhere, and he had just fired the one person who held all his secrets. I didn't call Elena. I didn't go home. I got in my Honda and drove straight to the one place Thomas Vance couldn't reach me. I drove to the D.C. headquarters of the Washington Post, to a reporter named Carla, who loved a front-page scandal. The lobby of the Post building was a massive atrium of glass and polished stone, the kind of place designed to make you feel very small. I walked up to the security desk and gave the guard my name. He made a call, and 10 minutes later, Carla stepped off the elevator. She was wearing a trench coat over a wrinkled blouse, holding a half-empty paper cup of coffee. She looked tired, but her eyes were sharp. She didn't say hello. She just looked at the black USB drive clenched in my fist. Is that what I think it is? She asked. It's the whole graveyard, I said. She swiped us through the turnstiles and led me up to the 4th floor. We didn't go to her desk. She booked a small, soundproof glass conference room near the back of the newsroom. She opened her laptop, plugged in the drive, and a folder icon popped up on the screen. You said this is unedited? She asked, her hand hovering over the trackpad. 10 years of disciplinary records, I said. Unredacted. Every payoff, every buried assault, every threat. And in the root folder, there's a chain of emails from yesterday. Thomas Vance, acting as board chair, explicitly ordering his staff to wipe the servers before the state can subpoena them. Carla clicked the folder. The screen populated with thousands of PDF files, meticulously organized by year and student last name. She clicked on the email chain first. She read it in silence. Her eyes tracked back and forth across the screen. I watched the realization hit her. He put it in writing, she whispered. The arrogant son of a bitch actually put a destruction order in writing. He thought he was protected by attorney-client privilege, I explained. But he's not their lawyer anymore. He's the client. It's a felony. Carla grabbed her phone. I need my editor in here. And legal. Don't touch anything. She stepped out of the room. I sat in the cheap, ergonomic chair, staring at the screen. I felt a massive, heavy wave of relief wash over me. It was out of my hands now. The Post had the resources. They had the lawyers to fight Vance's lawyers. I had done my job. 10 minutes later, Carla walked back in with a man in his 50s, wearing a vest and wire-rimmed glasses, her managing editor, and a younger woman in a sharp gray suit, who introduced herself as part of the paper's general counsel. They spent the next 30 minutes clicking through the files. The deeper they went, the quieter the room got. They opened Elena's file. They opened the file of the girl who was assaulted. They saw the corresponding ledgers from the contingency fund. The editor took off his glasses and rubbed his eyes. It's a gold mine. It's the biggest education scandal in the state's history. It brings down the board. It probably brings down a dozen local politicians who sit on their advisory committees. So we run it, Carla said, already pulling up a blank document to start outlining the piece. We put the destruction order above the fold tomorrow morning. The lawyer shook her head. We can't. I sat up straight. What do you mean you can't? You have the proof right in front of you. The lawyer pointed at the screen. Arthur, these files contain the unredacted names, addresses, and medical records of dozens of minors who were victims of sexual and physical abuse. We are not publishing that. If we leak this database, we violate a massive web of privacy laws. Thomas Vance's firm will hit us with a prior restraint injunction before the ink is dry, and a judge will grant it because we're threatening to out-abuse victims. So redact the names, I said. My heart was starting to hammer again. Just black out the names of the kids and publish the email from Vance. The email references specific cases, the lawyer countered smoothly. To make the story legally bulletproof against a defamation suit from a guy like Thomas Vance, we have to verify the underlying claims. That means my team needs to go through all 4,000 pages of this drive, redact every piece of identifying information for the minors, confirm the timeline, and prep a defense. That takes a week. Minimum, probably 2. I don't have 2 weeks, I said, my voice rising. I stood up. I don't even have 2 days. At 5 o'clock today, Hawthorne is pulling a settlement offer. If these families don't have proof that the new board is corrupt by 5 p.m., they are going to sign NDAs. Once they sign, Hawthorne buries this forever. They'll claim the files on that drive were doctored by a disgruntled employee. Without the victims to testify, the story dies. The editor looked at me sympathetically. Arthur, I understand the timeline, but we are a newspaper, not a police precinct. We don't publish raw data dumps involving children to break up NDAs. If you want this stopped by 5 o'clock, you need to take this to a judge and ask for an emergency injunction. I don't have standing to ask for an injunction, I said, the panic creeping into my chest. I'm not a state employee anymore. I'm a private citizen. A judge won't even look at me without a lawyer. lawyer, and I can't afford one. Then the families have to hold off on signing, Carla said quietly. Tell them what you found. Tell them we're working on it. Tell them to wait. I looked at the digital clock on the wall of the conference room. It was 3:45 p.m. They won't wait, I said. They're terrified. They have medical bills. $50,000 is life-changing money for some of them. If I don't have an article they can hold in their hands, they're going to take the check. I'm sorry, Arthur, the lawyer said. We're taking the drive. We're going to process it, but nothing is going live today. I walked out of the post building at 4:15 p.m. The DC traffic was already starting to snarl. I got into my Honda, locked the doors, and just sat there in the parking garage. The air in the car felt thick, unbreathable. I had the nuclear code, but the launch sequence was going to take a week. I pulled out my phone and dialed Elena's number. She picked up on the first ring. Arthur, where are you? The Changs are at the lawyer's office right now. The rest of us are on a group text. Hawthorne sent a courier to my house with the paperwork. We have 40 minutes. Elena, I said, forcing my voice to stay level. Listen to me very carefully. You cannot sign those papers. Do you have the proof? She asked. Her voice was thin, frantic. Did you find out where the money is coming from? I found something better, I said. I have the entire unedited server archive. I have an email from Thomas Vance ordering the destruction of evidence. It's a felony. It proves the new board is covering up the old board's crimes. I heard a sharp intake of breath on the other end of the line. Oh my God, where is it? Send it to me. I'll text it to the Changs right now. I can't send it to you, I said, closing my eyes. It has the names of all the minors in it. I gave it to the Washington Post. They're going to run a massive expose, but their legal team needs time to redact the files. It's not going to be published until next week. There was a long silence on the line. I could hear cars honking in the background of her end. Next week, Elena repeated. The hope was completely gone from her voice, replaced by a hollow, brittle exhaustion. Elena, you have to tell everyone to hold the line. If you wait a week, the state will step in. Hawthorne will be forced to compensate you legally, without the NDAs. You just have to trust me. Trust you, she said, and it wasn't a question. Arthur, you're asking me to tell a family drowning in debt to throw away $50,000 based on a promise that a newspaper might write an article next week. Do you know what Hawthorne's lawyers told us this morning? They said if we don't sign by 5, they are countersuing us for extortion, just like they did to you. They're bluffing, I pleaded. They don't have a case. They have unlimited money, she snapped. That's better than a case. The Changs are signing, Arthur. I can't stop them. And if they sign, the coalition is dead. The Millers are next, then the Smiths. Elena, please, for Leo. I'm doing this for Leo, she said, her voice cracking. I can't pay his therapist with a newspaper article. I'm sorry, Arthur. You tried. You really did. But we're done. She hung up. I sat in the car and watched the digital clock on my dashboard turn to 5 p.m. I had the files, I had the proof, and I had lost. The drive home to Maryland took 2 hours in the gridlock. By the time I pulled into my driveway, it was completely dark. The house looked normal from the outside. The porch light was on. The bushes needed trimming. It was an ordinary house on an ordinary street, completely detached from the legal warfare that had just consumed my life. I walked inside. The smell of takeout Chinese food hung in the air. Sarah and Maya were sitting at the kitchen table, eating out of cardboard cartons. They both looked up when I walked in. Sarah's eyes searched my face. She knew me well enough to read the defeat. Mom ordered lo mein, Maya said softly, breaking the silence. There's extra in the fridge. Thanks, sweetie, I said, taking off my coat and hanging it on the rack. My arms felt like they weighed 100 pounds each. I walked over to the fridge, grabbed a carton, and sat down at the table. I didn't get a fork. I just stared at the cardboard flaps. Did you talk to Elena? Sarah asked. Her tone was gentle. There was no, I told you so, in her voice, just a weary solidarity. I talked to her, I said. They signed. The NDAs are locked. Maya stopped chewing. She looked down at her plate. So Hawthorne gets away with it? The Washington Post has the files, I said, trying to find a silver lining that didn't feel like ash in my mouth. They're going to run a story next week. The public will know. Vance might get indicted for ordering the files deleted. But the kids, Maya pressed, her voice tight. The ones who got hurt. They took the money and now they have to stay quiet forever. They made the choice they had to make, Maya. Sarah intervened, putting a hand over our daughters. Sometimes survival isn't about winning. It's about getting out of the blast radius. Maya didn't argue, but she pulled her hand away. She stood up, grabbed her backpack, and went upstairs without another word. Sarah and I sat in the kitchen for a long time. I finally got a fork and ate cold noodles. They tasted like cardboard. You did what you could, Arthur, Sarah said, picking up our empty cartons and throwing them in the trash. You found the truth. That has to be enough. We have to focus on us now. You need to call David tomorrow and see if that reassignment in Western Maryland is still on the table. You need a job. I nodded slowly. She was right. The crusade was over. I was an unemployed man in his late 40s with a mortgage and a daughter who needed stability. I couldn't save the world. I could barely save my own living room. I'll call him tomorrow, I said. I slept for 10 hours that night, the heavy, dreamless sleep of total exhaustion. The next morning, it rained. A cold, gray, miserable Maryland drizzle. I woke up at 8, made coffee, and sat at the dining room table with my laptop, trying to work up the courage to draft an apology email to my former boss. I had to eat dirt. I had to beg for the job I had thrown in his face. At 9:45 a.m., the doorbell rang. I frowned. We weren't expecting any packages. Sarah was upstairs taking a shower. Maya was at school. I walked to the front door and opened it. There were 2 people standing on my porch. A woman in a tan raincoat holding a thick plastic clipboard, and a younger man standing slightly behind her, wearing a state ID badge on a lanyard around his neck. They weren't selling anything. They had the tired, flat expressions of people who deliver bad news for a living. Arthur Vance? The woman asked. Yes. Can I help you? She held up her own badge. Mr. Vance, my name is Cynthia Lewis. I'm an investigator with the Maryland Department of Human Services, Child Protective Services Division. This is my colleague, Mr. Hayes. We need to come inside and speak with you and your wife. I felt the blood drain from my face. My hand gripped the door handle so hard it hurt. Child Protective Services? I repeated. The words didn't make sense. There must be some mistake. We received a formal report concerning the welfare of your daughter, Maya Vance, the woman said, her voice completely devoid of emotion. It was a script she had read 1,000 times, specifically allegations of medical neglect, a volatile home environment, and erratic parental behavior resulting in physical harm to the minor. May we come in? No, I said instantly, blocking the doorway with my body. No, you may not come in. Who filed this report? You know reports are anonymous, Mr. Vance, she said, stepping just an inch closer. But the allegations involve severe hypothermia and nerve damage that occurred while under your supervision, followed by a period of extreme domestic instability, including you losing your employment and your wife temporarily leaving the home. The breath was knocked out of my lungs. Thomas Vance. He didn't just use his lawyers. He didn't just threaten me with an extortion suit. He had dug into the police report about the shed. He had hired private investigators to watch my house. They knew Sarah had left with a duffel bag. They knew I had quit my job. And he had taken all those facts, twisted them into a narrative of domestic abuse, and fed them to the the state. He wasn't trying to send me to jail anymore. He was trying to take my daughter. My daughter was locked in a maintenance shed by upperclassmen at her school, I said, my voice shaking with a rage so profound it blurred my vision. I was the one who pulled her out of there. I was the one who held the school accountable. This is retaliation from the board of directors at Hawthorne Academy. Mr. Vance, the man, Hayes, spoke up for the first time. We are aware of your dispute with the school. However, we have sworn affidavits from 3 individuals claiming that you have been displaying signs of severe paranoia, that you have been illegally digging through trash dumpsters, and that your obsession with this conspiracy has created a dangerous environment for your child. Sworn affidavits. The janitor, the cafeteria workers. Thomas Vance had forced his own staff to sign statements against me. If you refuse us entry, Cynthia Lewis said, pulling a pen from her pocket, we will return this afternoon with a police escort and a temporary removal order from a family court judge. It is highly preferable that we conduct a preliminary interview and home inspection voluntarily. Is your wife home? I heard footsteps on the stairs behind me. I turned my head. Sarah was standing halfway down the staircase, wearing a bathrobe, her hair wrapped in a towel. She was staring at the open door, at the badges, at the clipboards. Arthur, she said, her voice trembling. Who is that? Mrs. Vance, Cynthia called out smoothly, looking past me. We're with Child Protective Services. We need to ask you a few questions about your husband's recent behavior and the safety of your daughter. I looked back at the woman on my porch. I wanted to scream. I wanted to grab her clipboard and throw it into the street, but I knew exactly how this system worked. I had worked adjacent to these agencies for 5 years. If I yelled, if I showed anger, it went into the file. Subject was hostile and aggressive. If I shut the door, it went into the file. Subject was uncooperative. They had weaponized the bureaucracy against me. Come in, I said, stepping aside. My voice sounded dead. They walked into my living room. They didn't sit down. Cynthia Lewis began taking notes immediately, scanning the room, looking at the dust on the baseboards, the unread mail on the coffee table. Sarah came down the rest of the stairs, pulling her robe tightly around herself. She stood next to me. I reached out and took her hand. It was ice cold. Mrs. Vance, Cynthia said, turning to Sarah, can you confirm that you vacated this residence on Monday afternoon due to an altercation with your husband? Sarah looked at me, panic flaring in her eyes. I went to my sister's house for a night. We had an argument about finances. It wasn't an altercation. He never touched me. Cynthia wrote something down. And can you confirm that your husband is currently unemployed? He resigned from his state position, Sarah said, her voice growing defensive. He wasn't fired. And the medical treatment for Maya's frostbite? Hayes chimed in. Has she attended all her scheduled physical therapy appointments since her father lost his health insurance? It was a surgical strike. They knew exactly where we were bleeding. We are paying out of pocket, I said sharply. She hasn't missed a single session. We will need the contact information for her physical therapist to verify that, Cynthia said without looking up from her clipboard. Mr. Vance, we need you to submit to a mandatory psychological evaluation within the next 72 hours. We will also be speaking with Maya privately at her high school this afternoon. No, Sarah said, stepping forward. You are not going to her school. You are not pulling her out of class to interrogate her. She's been through enough trauma. She is finally making friends. Mrs. Vance, we don't need your permission to interview a minor on school grounds during an active investigation, Cynthia said, looking Sarah dead in the eye. If you attempt to interfere, or if you remove her from the school before we arrive, we will secure an emergency custody order. Do you understand? Sarah let out a small, broken sound. She covered her mouth with her hand and backed away until she hit the wall. We understand, I said. Good, Cynthia said. She handed me a business card. We will be in touch tomorrow with the next steps. Do not attempt to contact anyone at Hawthorne Academy. Do not leave the county. They turned and walked out the front door. The latch clicked shut behind them. The silence in the house was absolute. The rain beat against the front windows. Sarah slid down the wall until she was sitting on the hardwood floor. She pulled her knees to her chest and started to cry. It wasn't a loud, dramatic cry. It was the quiet, suffocating sobbing of someone who has finally been broken. I knelt down next to her. I tried to put my arms around her, but she flinched away. Don't, she whispered. Sarah, I'm going to fix this. I know a lawyer. I can call. You did this, she said. She looked up at me, and the raw, unvarnished hatred in her eyes paralyzed me. I begged you to leave it alone. I told you they would destroy us, and you just couldn't let it go. I was trying to protect other kids. I don't care about other kids, she screamed, the sound tearing her throat. I care about my daughter. I care about my family. And now the state is going to go to her school, pull her into a counselor's office, and ask her if her father is crazy. They're going to put a file on her that follows her forever. They might take her away from us, Arthur. They might put her in foster care because you had to play the hero. She scrambled to her feet, wiping her face with the back of her hand. I have to go to the school, she said, her voice shaking. I have to be there when they talk to her. I have to protect her. Sarah, they said if we interfere. I don't care what they said, she yelled. I am not leaving my daughter alone in a room with those people. She ran upstairs to get dressed. I stayed on the floor. I felt like I was buried under 1,000 feet of dirt. Thomas Vance hadn't just beaten me. He had gutted me. He had used the very system I dedicated my life to the state to rip my family apart. He knew that even if the Washington Post published the story next week, the damage to my life would be done. The CPS file would exist. The legal fees to fight them would bankrupt me. My marriage would be over. My phone buzzed in my pocket. I pulled it out slowly. It was Carla from the Washington Post. I didn't want to answer it. I wanted to throw the phone through the window, but muscle memory took over, and I swiped accept. What? I said, my voice hollow. Arthur, you need to turn on the news. Channel 4, local. Carla's voice was tight, urgent. It wasn't the voice of a reporter who had a story scheduled for next week. I can't right now, Carla. Things are bad here. Arthur, turn on the television, right now. I pulled myself off the floor. I walked into the living room, picked up the remote, and hit the power button. I flipped to Channel 4. It was a live broadcast from the front gates of Hawthorne Elite Academy. The rain was pouring down, but there were half a dozen news vans parked on the shoulder. A reporter in a rain slicker was standing in front of the massive wrought iron gates. Behind her, 3 dark blue sedans were parked on the circular driveway in front of the main administrative building. They weren't state police cars. They were unmarked, but they had federal plates. We are coming to you live from Bethesda, the reporter was saying, holding an earpiece to her ear, where just moments ago, federal agents from the FBI's white-collar crime division arrived at the campus of Hawthorne Academy. We do not have official confirmation yet, but sources indicate this raid is connected to the sudden resignation of former board chairman Richard Caldwell earlier this week. I stared at the screen. The FBI. Carla, what is this? I asked into the phone. The FBI doesn't move this fast on state grant fraud. They take months. It's not the grant fraud, Arthur, Carla said. I could hear keyboards clacking furiously in the background on her end. It's the NDAs. What? 10 minutes ago, a massive encrypted data dump was sent to the Department of Justice, the Maryland Attorney General, and every major news desk in D.C., including ours. Carla said. It wasn't sent by me. It wasn't sent by the post. Who sent it? I asked, my grip tightening on the phone. It was sent by an anonymous proxy server, Carla replied. But the subject line was a quote, to foster community understanding. I froze. That was the exact phrase Wallace Sterling had used in his letters to the victim families. Arthur, the dump didn't just have the unredacted disciplinary files. It had bank records, international wire transfers. Thomas Vance wasn't just paying those families out of the state grant fund. He was wiring the settlement money through offshore accounts in the Caymans to avoid state tax flags and using the school's nonprofit status to write it off as an educational expense. He was committing federal wire fraud and tax evasion on top of witness tampering. How did someone get his bank records? I asked. The USB drive the secretary gave me didn't have banking data. It only had the disciplinary files and the emails. I don't know, Carla said. But whoever leaked it didn't care about redacting names. They dropped the whole thing raw. The DOJ had no choice but to raid the school before the board could physically destroy the financial ledgers. Thomas Vance was arrested at his law firm 20 minutes ago. I watched the TV screen. A man in a suit, carrying a cardboard box full of files, walked out of the administrative building and loaded it into the trunk of one of the federal sedans. Someone had beaten me to the punch. Someone with access to Hawthorne's deepest financial architecture. Someone who hated the board as much as I did, but who didn't have to play by the rules of journalism or state bureaucracy. Arthur, the story is out, Carla said. We're publishing our piece in an hour. We're focusing on the cover-up and the destruction order, but the floodgates are open. The NDAs are legally void if they were funded by illegal wire transfers. Elena and the families, they're off the hook. I hung up the phone. I didn't feel victorious. I just felt stunned. I heard footsteps on the stairs. Sarah came down, fully dressed, her keys in her hand. Her eyes were red and puffy. She looked at the television screen. She saw the FBI cars. What is that? She asked, her voice faltering. Thomas Vance was arrested, I said quietly. Someone leaked his banking records to the feds. The NDAs are void. It's over. Sarah stared at the screen for a long time. The tension didn't leave her body. The relief I expected to see on her face wasn't there. Does this mean CPS is going to drop the investigation? She asked. It was a cold shower of reality. Thomas Vance was in handcuffs, but the bureaucratic machine he had aimed at me was already in motion. The state doesn't just delete a child welfare report because the guy who called it in got arrested. The machine has to finish its cycle. No, I said. They still have to interview us. They still have to talk to Maya. Sarah closed her eyes. She gripped her car keys so tightly her knuckles cracked. I'm going to the school, she said. I'm coming with you, I told her. No, she said sharply, turning to look at me. You stay here. If you go, you'll try to fight with them. You'll quote statutes and state laws and you'll make them angry. I need to be a mother. I need to sit with my daughter and hold her hand while the state asks her if she feels safe in her own home. I have to clean up your mess. She walked out the front door and didn't look back. I stood in the living room for a long time. The television droned on, reporters talking over each other about the shockwaves hitting the DC elite. I had won the war. The corrupt institution was falling apart. The bullies were facing justice. And I was completely alone in a quiet house, waiting for a government agency to decide if I was fit to be a father. I walked into the kitchen and sat down at the table. My laptop was still open. My email inbox was refreshing. There was one new message. It wasn't from David at the Department of Education. It wasn't from Carla. The sender address was an encrypted string of random letters and numbers. The subject line was blank. I clicked on it. There was no text in the body of the email, just a single audio file attachment. I reached out with a trembling hand and clicked play. There was a burst of static and then a voice, a young, male voice. It was shaking, breathing heavily, sounding like it was recorded on a cell phone in an echoing room. I did it. I sent the files. My dad's offshore accounts, the wire transfers, all of it. I found the master ledger in his home office safe. He told me I was going to Switzerland to make this all go away. He told me he was going to destroy you. I'm sorry about the shed. I'm so sorry. Tell Maya. Tell her she doesn't have to be scared anymore. The recording clicked off. I sat back in my chair, staring at the screen. Harrison Caldwell, the boy who had locked my daughter in the shed. The boy whose father had started this entire nightmare to protect him. When he realized his father wasn't protecting him, but just preserving his own empire, Harrison had taken the keys to the kingdom and handed them to the FBI. He hadn't done it out of bravery. He had done it out of terror. The system his father built was so toxic, it had finally consumed its own son. I closed the laptop. The quiet in the house was deafening. The rain outside seemed to drum louder against the glass. I had spent the last month fighting monsters in suits, tearing through paper trails and confronting lawyers. But in the end, it was a scared 14-year-old boy who had pulled the pin on the grenade. I heard the rumble of a car engine pulling into my driveway. I stood up and walked to the front window. It wasn't Sarah's car. It wasn't CPS. It was a sleek, black Lexus SUV, the kind of car that costs more than my house. The engine cut off. The driver's side door opened. Richard Caldwell stepped out into the rain. He didn't have an umbrella. He wasn't wearing a tie. His suit jacket was soaked, his hair plastered to his forehead. He didn't look like a master of the universe anymore. He looked like a man who had lost absolutely everything. He looked at my front window, straight at me. He didn't move toward the door. He just stood there in the driveway, the rain running down his face. My phone vibrated in my pocket. I pulled it out. Mom is in the principal's office with the state people. The text from Maya Reed. They want you to come. Now, I looked from the phone to the man standing in my driveway, the man whose son had just destroyed both of our lives for completely different reasons. I didn't grab a coat. I just walked to the front door and pulled it open. Richard Caldwell stood at the bottom of my porch steps, the rain completely ruining a suit that probably cost more than my first car. He didn't look angry. He looked hollowed out. The arrogant sneer that had defined every interaction we'd ever had was gone, replaced by the slack-jawed stare of a man who was watching his life burn to the ground in real time. Did you give them the files? He asked. His voice barely carried over the sound of the rain hitting the gutters. He didn't say hello. He didn't threaten me. He just asked the question like a man begging for a firing squad to explain the charges. I didn't give them the banking records, Richard, I said, leaning against the doorframe. The cold air was biting through my shirt, but I didn't care. I didn't even have them. He blinked, the rain running into his eyes. Then who? Vance? Did Thomas cut a deal? No, I said. I looked at this man, the man who had tried to ruin my career, who had driven my family to the brink of collapse, who had called the near death of my daughter a harmless prank. I thought I would feel a surge of triumph telling him the truth, but I just felt exhausted. It was Harrison. Richard flinched like I had struck him across the face. You're lying, he whispered. He found the ledger in your home safe, I said flatly. He emailed it to the DOJ. He sent me an audio confession right before he did it. He was terrified of you, Richard. He was terrified of the machine you built. He didn't want to go to Switzerland. He just wanted it to stop. Richard took a step backward. His heel caught on the edge of the driveway, and for a second, he looked like he was going to fall. He caught his balance, but his shoulders slumped, caving in inward. He looked at his hands, then at the wet pavement. He didn't say another word. He didn't scream or deny it again. He just turned around, walked back to his Lexus, and got in. He didn't start the engine right away. He just sat behind the wheel, a ghost in a luxury car. I didn't wait to see what he would do next. I pulled my keys out of my pocket, ran through the rain to my Honda, and backed out of the driveway, leaving him sitting there. The drive to the public high school took 12 minutes. I drove like a machine, strictly adhering to the speed limit, my hands locked at 10 and 2. The adrenaline from the morning had completely metabolized into a cold, heavy dread. The FBI raid at Hawthorne was happening in a different universe. In my universe, a woman with a clipboard and a state ID badge was sitting in a room with my 14-year-old daughter, deciding if I was a danger to her. I parked in the visitor lot, shoved my way through the heavy glass double doors, and walked straight to the main office. The school secretary, a woman in a floral cardigan, looked up from her computer. "Can I help you? I'm Arthur Vance. My daughter is Maya Vance. I was told she's in the principal's office with CPS." The secretary's expression tightened. She gave me a sympathetic, nervous look and pointed to a closed door down the hall. "They asked not to be disturbed, Mr. Vance." "I'm her father," I said, walking past the desk. I didn't knock. I pushed the door open. The principal's office was cramped, smelling faintly of stale coffee and floor wax. Sarah was sitting in a plastic chair pushed up against the wall, her arms crossed tightly over her chest. She looked up when I walked in, and the sheer terror in her eyes made my stomach drop. Maya was sitting at a small conference table in the center of the room. Across from her was Cynthia Lewis, the CPS investigator who had been on my porch an hour ago, her clipboard resting on the table. Hayes, her partner, was standing by the window, taking notes. "Mr. Vance," Cynthia said, her voice dripping with that same terrifyingly polite bureaucratic calm, "we explicitly asked your wife to conduct this interview without your presence." "I don't care," I said, walking over and pulling up a chair next to Maya. I didn't look at Cynthia. I looked at my daughter. She looked small. Her hands were folded in her lap, and she was picking at the edge of her thumbnail, a nervous habit she'd had since she was 6. "Are you okay, Maya?" She nodded once, a tiny, jerky motion. "Mr. Vance, if you disrupt this interview, we will terminate it and proceed to a family court judge to request an emergency placement," Cynthia warned. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't have to. The threat was absolute. "I'm not disrupting," I said, keeping my hands flat on the table so they could see I wasn't a physical threat. "But I'm not leaving my daughter alone. Ask your questions." Cynthia stared at me for a long beat, her face impassive. Then she turned back to Maya. "Maya, before your father interrupted, we were talking about the atmosphere at home over the last few weeks," Cynthia said, her tone softening into an artificial gentleness. "You mentioned that your father has been staying up very late working on files. Does he ever get angry when he's working?" "He's not angry at me," Maya said quickly, her voice tight. "He was just stressed because of the lawsuit. The lawsuit filed against him by the Hawthorne board," Cynthia clarified, writing something down. "Did he ever shout? Did he ever throw anything? Or hit the walls?" "No," Maya said, her eyes darting to me and then back to the clipboard. He paced a lot, and he drank a lot of coffee. He was just trying to fix it." "Fix what, Maya?" Hayes asked from the window. "The school," Maya said. "He wanted to help the other kids who got hurt." "Kid, and did you feel like you had to take care of him while he was doing this?" Cynthia asked. "Did you feel responsible for managing his emotions, or your mother's emotions, during this time?" It was a textbook question. They were looking for parentification. They were building a case that my obsession with the Hawthorne investigation had emotionally abandoned my child. "No," Maya said, but her voice cracked on the word. She swallowed hard. I just wanted things to be quiet. I asked him to stop. Mom asked him to stop." Cynthia's pen scratched across the paper. The sound was deafening in the small room. "And when he refused to stop," Cynthia said smoothly, "your mother packed a bag and left the house. Is that correct?" Sarah let out a sharp, ragged breath from the corner. "I left for one night," she said, her voice shaking. "It was a cooling off period. It is a normal thing for married couples to do when they are under extreme financial stress." "Mrs. Vance, please refrain from coaching the minor," Cynthia said without looking at Sarah. She kept her eyes locked on Maya. "Maya, did you feel safe when your mother left?" "Yes," Maya said, tears finally spilling over her eyelashes. She hastily wiped them away with the back of her hand. "My dad would never hurt me. You don't understand. The people at my old school, they left me in a shed to freeze. They are the ones who hurt me. My dad is the only one who fought them." "We understand that you experienced a trauma at Hawthorne, Maya," Cynthia said, her tone perfectly even, completely devoid of actual empathy. "But our job is to ensure that your current living situation is stable. Your father recently resigned from his job, effectively eliminating your family's primary income and health insurance, in order to pursue a personal investigation that resulted in him bringing trash bags full of stolen documents into your home. Does that sound like a stable environment to you?" "The people who filed this report against me were just arrested by the FBI 20 minutes ago," I interjected, unable to hold it back any longer. "Thomas Vance is in federal custody for fraud and witness tampering. The report is retaliatory garbage." Cynthia slowly turned her head to look at me. "Mr. Vance, the legal troubles of the reporter have no bearing on the facts of this room. The fact is, you are unemployed. The fact is, your bank accounts were recently frozen. The fact is, your wife left the home due to your erratic behavior. And the fact is, your daughter is sitting here crying because the environment you have created is deeply chaotic." She tapped her pen against the clipboard. "We are not unsympathetic to the stress you've been under," she continued, her voice chillingly clinical. "But the department's primary concern is the minor. Given the extreme volatility of your household, the ongoing media attention, and the documented marital friction, we do not believe the current arrangement is in Maya's best interest." Sarah stood up from her chair. "What are you saying?" "We are saying," Hayes stepped forward, "that we have enough grounds to seek a temporary removal order today." The room spun. I felt the blood rush out of my head. Maya let out a small gasp and reached out, grabbing my sleeve, her fingers digging into my arm. "No," Sarah said, her voice rising in panic. "No, you can't take her. She has a home. She has a family." "However," Cynthia said, raising a hand to cut Sarah off, "we prefer to keep families intact when possible, provided a safety plan can be agreed upon." She pulled a pre-printed form out from under the papers on her clipboard and slid it across the table toward me. "This is a voluntary separation agreement," Cynthia said. "It stipulates that for the duration of the investigation, which typically takes 30 to 45 days, you, Mr. Vance, will vacate the primary residence. You will not have unsupervised contact with the minor. Mrs. Vance will assume sole temporary physical custody. You will agree to the mandatory psychological evaluation, and you will cease all contact with the media." I stared at the piece of paper. It looked so ordinary, just black ink on white paper, with a few blank lines at the bottom for signatures, but it was a bomb. "You want to kick me out of my own house?" I said. My voice was a hollow whisper. "We are offering you a chance to de-escalate a highly toxic environment without involving a foster placement," Cynthia corrected. "If you refuse to sign, Mr. Hayes and I will drive to the courthouse house right now. Given the evidence of your recent behavior, a judge will sign the removal order before 5 o'clock. Maya will be placed with a state-approved foster family until a formal hearing can be scheduled, which could take weeks. You can't do this, Maya cried, her voice finally breaking completely. She looked at Cynthia with absolute desperation. He didn't do anything wrong. He was trying to protect me. It's okay, Maya, I said automatically, though my own chest felt like it was caving in. I squeezed her hand. I looked at Sarah. She was standing frozen by the wall, her face pale, staring at the piece of paper on the table. She didn't look angry anymore. She just looked utterly defeated. The state had boxed us in perfectly. Thomas Vance might be going to federal prison, but he had managed to land one final, devastating blow on his way down. He had used the blunt instrument of the bureaucracy to shatter my family. If I fought them, they would take Maya. They would put her in the system. I knew what the system looked like. I had audited it. I knew the overworked caseworkers, the crowded group homes, the cold, sterile reality of being a ward of the state. I would never, ever let my daughter experience that. I reached across the table and picked up Cynthia's pen. Arthur, wait, Sarah said, stepping forward. Her voice was barely a whisper. I looked up at her. There's no waiting, Sarah. If I don't sign this, they take her today. You heard them. Where will you go? She asked. The anger that had been between us yesterday was gone, replaced by the grim, terrifying reality of the trap we were caught in. I'll figure it out, I said. I looked down at the paper. I signed my name on the line. The ink felt heavy, permanent. I pushed the paper back across the table. Cynthia reviewed the signature, nodded once, and tucked the form back into her clipboard. Thank you, Mr. Vance. This shows a willingness to cooperate. You have until 8 o'clock tonight to pack your belongings and vacate the premises. We will be conducting random check-ins with Mrs. Vance to ensure compliance. If you are found on the property, the agreement is void, and we will proceed with the removal order. She stood up, buttoning her raincoat. Hayes followed suit. We will contact you regarding the scheduling of your psychological evaluation, Cynthia added. Have a good afternoon. They walked out of the principal's office, closing the door behind them with a quiet, decisive click. The silence they left behind was suffocating. Maya buried her face in her hands and began to sob, her shoulders shaking violently. Sarah crossed the room quickly, wrapping her arms around Maya, pulling her daughter's head against her chest. She stroked Maya's hair, whispering quiet, meaningless comforts. I sat at the table, my hands resting on the cheap laminate surface. I had won the war against Hawthorne. The board was collapsing, the cover-up was exposed. But sitting in that cramped office, listening to my daughter cry because I was being forced out of her life, it didn't feel like a victory. It felt like I had burned my own house down just to kill the termites. I stared at the wood grain on the table for another 10 seconds. Then the investigator part of my brain, the part that had been buried under sheer panic and exhaustion, finally kicked back in. Cynthia had specifically mentioned times sworn affidavits from 3 individuals: the janitor, the cafeteria workers, people who had been directly ordered to lie by Thomas Vance. Thomas Vance, who had just been arrested by the FBI for witness tampering and extortion. I stood up so fast, the plastic chair scraped violently against the linoleum. Sarah stopped stroking Maya's hair and looked at me, startled. Arthur, what are you doing? Sarah asked, her voice tight. They said to just go pack your things. I'm not packing anything, I said. I yanked the office door open and jogged down the hallway. Cynthia and Hayes were at the front desk, waiting for the secretary to buzz them through the main security doors. Cynthia, I called out. My voice echoed down the quiet school corridor. She turned, her expression instantly hardening. Mr. Vance, I strongly advise you to lower your voice and return to your family. Those 3 affidavits you have, I said, stopping a few feet away from her. The ones from the Hawthorne staff claiming I'm a danger to my child. We are not discussing the details of the report, Mr. Vance. You don't have to. I'm telling you. I pulled my phone out of my pocket and brought up the live news feed Carla had told me to watch. The banner headline was flashing across the screen in bright red letters. Hawthorne board chair arrested by FBI in multi-million-dollar fraud and extortion probe. I held the screen up so both of them could clearly read it. The man who ordered his staff to sign those affidavits against me was just taken into federal custody 20 minutes ago, I said, my voice dead calm. The charges are federal wire fraud, tax evasion, and witness tampering. He used his position to coerce his employees into filing false police reports and CPS claims to stop a state audit. Cynthia looked at the screen. Hayes leaned in, his eyes widening slightly. I don't know what you think this proves, Cynthia started, but the bureaucratic certainty in her voice had wavered, just a fraction. It proves that your entire case file is built on suborned perjury engineered by a federal criminal, I said. You take that separation agreement to a family court judge this afternoon, and tomorrow morning, the Department of Justice is going to subpoena you to explain why you are actively participating in Thomas Vance's witness intimidation scheme. I watched the gears turning in her head. Cynthia wasn't a monster. She was a state employee trying to close a file without making waves. The moment the file became radioactive, her priorities shifted. Bureaucrats survive by avoiding the blast radius. Mr. Hayes, I said, turning to her partner, do you want your name attached to a federal obstruction of justice charge because some rich guy in Bethesda used your department as a weapon? Hayes looked at Cynthia. He took a subtle step back. He didn't want any part of this. Cynthia stared at the news footage playing silently on my phone. The FBI agents carrying boxes out of the school she had just taken affidavits from. She looked down at the clipboard in her hand. She unclipped the voluntary separation agreement I had signed 5 minutes ago. She didn't tear it up. That would be dramatic, and she wasn't dramatic. She just folded it in half and slid it into her raincoat pocket. In light of new developments regarding the credibility of the reporting parties, Cynthia said, her voice completely flat, slipping back into her administrative armor, the department will place this investigation on an administrative hold, pending review by our legal counsel. The voluntary separation agreement is suspended. Suspended, I repeated. You do not have to vacate the premises tonight, Mr. Vance, she said. We will be in touch. She turned around, the secretary buzzed the door, and they walked out into the rain. I stood in the hallway for a long moment, listening to the heavy glass doors click shut. I took a deep, shuddering breath. It was the first time my lungs felt like they could fully expand in a month. I walked back into the principal's office. Sarah and Maya were still sitting there. They looked up at me, bracing for whatever bad news they thought I had just provoked. We're going home, I said. All of us. Sarah blinked. What do you mean? You signed it. They said you have to leave. Thomas Vance coerced those affidavits. The FBI raid just made them legally toxic. CPS is backing off. The investigation is suspended. I watched the words hit them. Maya let out a sound that was half sob, half laugh, and launched herself out of the chair. She hit me so hard I stumbled backward, wrapping her arms around my neck, burying her face in my shoulder. I held her tight, closing my eyes, feeling the sheer weight of her relief. I looked over Maya's shoulder at Sarah. She was crying again, but the anger was gone. The absolute terror was gone. She stood up and walked over to us. She wrapped her arms around both of us, resting her forehead against my chest. We just stood there in the middle of the principal's office, a messy, bruised, confused, exhausted family. I'm sorry, Sarah whispered into my shirt. I should have trusted you. I should have told you how bad it was getting, I said. We're both sorry, but it's over. We didn't go back to work or class that day. We drove home together. The news vans were gone from our street. Richard Caldwell's Lexus was gone from our driveway. The house was just a house again. The fallout took months to settle. The Washington Post article ran the next morning, blowing the lid entirely off Hawthorne Elite Academy. The state froze their charter indefinitely. Thomas Vance and Wallace Sterling were both indicted on dozens of federal charges. The Caldwell's empire collapsed under a mountain of IRS liens, DOJ fines, and public disgrace. Elena and the other families filed a massive class action lawsuit against the remaining Hawthorne endowment. Without the NDAs hanging over their heads, they won easily. The money didn't magically fix what happened to their kids, but it paid for the therapy. It secured their futures, and most importantly, it gave them back their voices. Harrison Caldwell was sent to live with his mother in California before his father's trial even started. I never spoke to him again. I don't know if he regrets what he did to Maya, but I hope he found whatever peace he was looking for when he hit send on that email and tore down his own house. As for me, I didn't go back to the Department of Education. David called a week later, offering me my old job back with a profound apology and a promise of a promotion. I declined. Instead, I took a job at a private forensic accounting firm in DC. They specialize in tracking corporate fraud and embezzlement. The pay is significantly better, the hours are worse, but they don't try to shut me down when I find something ugly in the ledgers. Maya stayed at the public high school. Her robotics team placed third in the state regionals in April. I took the day off to watch her present their pneumatic lift. She stood on a stage in a crowded gymnasium, talking about air pressure and valves, her hands flying as she explained the math to the judges. There was no blue tint to her fingertips. She didn't look over her shoulder. She just looked like a teenager who knew exactly how smart she was. After the competition, we went out for pizza, just the three of us. We sat in a booth at a loud, greasy Italian place, arguing about whether pineapple belonged on the second pie. It was normal. It was boring. It was the greatest thing in the world. The arrogant men who tried to break my daughter thought their money and their titles made them untouchable. They thought they could bury the truth under NDAs, intimidation, and layers of bureaucracy. They forgot one simple fact. You can buy a lot of things in this world, but you can never outbid a father who has nothing left to lose.